Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The year was 2159, and humanity had long since unlocked the secrets of the mind. No longer confined to spoken language or written words, people could now connect with beings from distant stars on a level far deeper, the level of the soul. Through the use of a device known as the Soul Bridge, humans could communicate with alien species, not through technology, but through shared consciousness. This was more than communication, it was connection, healing, and revelation. Zane Varela sat in his quiet room, light streaming through the tall windows as he stared out at the bustling city beyond. The skyline was a patchwork of gleaming towers, their surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. The city had changed over the years, a blend of old-world architecture and new-world technology. But none of that mattered to Zane in this moment. His thoughts were elsewhere, focused inward, as they often were. As a soul guide, Zane had seen and felt things most people couldn't begin to comprehend. His role wasn't just to communicate with alien species, it was to help people heal, to guide them through the deepest parts of their being by connecting them with other life forms who saw the universe through entirely different lenses. It was a noble calling, one that had brought Zane immense respect and recognition. Yet, for all the healing he had guided others through, Zane himself remained untethered, like a soul adrift. He had spent years helping others confront their pain and trauma, but he had never dared to take a journey of his own. There was always something holding him back, something he couldn't quite name. A soft chime broke through his thoughts, signaling the arrival of the visitor. Zane rose from his chair and made his way to the entrance. The door slid open, revealing a woman standing on the other side, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and grief. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, and a face that carried the weight of recent tragedy. "Evelyn," Zane said gently, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated for a moment before entering, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something that could offer her comfort. Zane could feel her turmoil before she even spoke. It radiated off her like waves of heated sorrow, anger, and the deep ache of loss. "I don't know what else to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I've tried everything, and nothing helps." Zane guided her to a chair, sitting across from her as he let her words sink in. He had heard these stories before. The pain of loss was universal, whether it was a child, a partner, or a friend. For Evelyn, it had been her entire family taken from her in an instant during a freak accident that no one could have predicted. Now she was alone, with no direction, no hope, and a grief so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. "You're not alone in this," Zane said softly. "We can take this journey together. There are beings out there who can offer you comfort, who can help you see things in a new light. It won't bring your family back, but it might help you find peace." Evelyn nodded, though her eyes remained hollow. "I don't know if I believe in all of this," she admitted. "I've heard about the Soul Bridge, but it's not about belief," Zane interrupted gently. "It's about connection. You'll feel it, and you'll come to understand that healing is possible, even when it feels like everything is broken." He could see her hesitation, the weariness in her gaze. But she was here, and that was enough. Zane stood and walked over to a small table in the corner of the room. On it sat the Soul Bridge device, a sleek silver disc no larger than a dinner plate. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if alive with the energy of countless souls it had connected over the years. Zane placed the device in the center of the room, then returned to Evelyn, offering his hand. "Are you ready?" Evelyn looked at his hand, her eyes filling with unshed tears. After a moment, she reached out and took it, her fingers cold and trembling. "I'm ready," she whispered. Zane guided her to the floor, where they both sat cross-legged facing the device. He activated it with a touch, and immediately, the room seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. A soft light emanated from the device, bathing them in a warm, calming glow. "Close your eyes," Zane instructed softly. "Focus on your breathing. Let everything else fade away." Evelyn obeyed, her breath shaky at first but gradually becoming more steady. Zane watched her for a moment, then closed his own eyes, allowing his consciousness to expand outward. He could feel the device working, the subtle pull of energy as it reached across the vastness of space, seeking out the Scifiorians, the alien species they would be connecting with today. The Scifiorians were ancient, far older than humanity, and they were known for their deep sense of peace and wisdom. Their energy was like a balm for wounded souls, offering comfort and understanding in a way that no words ever could. Zane had guided many people through journeys with them, and every time, the result was the same, a profound healing. As the connection deepened, Zane felt the familiar pull, as if his consciousness was being drawn into a vast ocean of light. He could sense Evelyn's presence beside him, her mind reaching out, tentative and unsure. Together, they drifted through the cosmos, until finally, they arrived in the presence of the Scifiorians. The alien beings greeted them with warmth, their energy enveloping Zane and Evelyn like a soft, glowing embrace. There were no words exchanged, but the meaning was clear. The Scifiorians could feel Evelyn's pain, and they responded with a gentle, soothing pulse of energy that flowed through her like a wave of compassion. Zane could feel the tension in Evelyn's mind, the raw grief that had been festering for so long. The Scifiorians didn't shy away from it. Instead, they leaned into it, their energy wrapping around the pain, softening it, easing it. Slowly, Zane could feel the shift in Evelyn. Her sorrow began to ebb, replaced by something deeper, something more profound. The Scifiorians shared their understanding of loss, and not just the loss of individuals, but the loss of entire civilizations, species that had come and gone in the vast expanse of time. They showed Evelyn that while loss was inevitable, it was not the end. Love and connection endured, even beyond death. Evelyn gasped softly, her soul trembling with the weight of the revelation. She could feel her family not as individual spirits, but as a presence, a force of love that transcended the physical world. It was as if the Scifiorians were showing her that her loved ones were still with her, not in body, but in the energy that connected all living things. Tears streamed down her face, and Zane could feel her walls crumbling. The Scifiorians' energy continued to flow, gently soothing her wounded heart, mending the pieces that had been shattered. Zane remained a silent observer, his role simply to guide, to facilitate. This was Evelyn's journey, her healing. When the connection finally began to fade, Zane felt a soft pang of loss himself. The Scifiorians' presence was so comforting, so serene, that it was always hard to leave. But as the light dimmed, and the room returned to its normal state, Zane opened his eyes to find Evelyn sitting before him, her face wet with tears but her expression soft, peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. I didn't think it was possible to feel this way again." Zane smiled gently. "The Scifiorians have a way of showing us things we can't always see on our own." "You're not alone, Evelyn." "You never were." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, a hope. It was a look Zane had seen many times before, and it always brought him a sense of satisfaction, knowing he had helped someone find their way back to themselves. But as Evelyn stood to leave, Zane couldn't shake the growing discomfort in his chest. Watching her heal had stirred something deep within him, something he had long buried. He had been a guide for so long, helping others confront their pain, but what about his own? He had never taken the journey himself, never allowed himself to be vulnerable in the way his clients had. Zane watched as Evelyn disappeared through the door, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep unease settle over him. The soul bridge had brought him peace and purpose, but it had also become a shield, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to lower. Zane sat in the quiet of his room long after Evelyn left, the faint hum of the soul bridge still lingering in the air. The feeling of discomfort in his chest gnawed at him, a reminder that his role as a guide was not without its own burdens. He had never before allowed himself to face his own pain, always hiding behind the needs of others. His clients came to him broken, seeking healing and connection, and it was his job to lead them to solace. Yet, with each passing journey, Zane felt the weight of his own unresolved emotions growing heavier. The day after Evelyn's journey, Zane was visited by a man named Minister Arcos, a well-known politician in the region. Arcos was nothing like the clients Zane usually encountered. Where Evelyn had been fragile and open in her grief, Arcos radiated control and calculation. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that gave nothing away. His appearance in Zane's doorway felt like a clash of worlds. Zane's domain of spiritual connection meeting Arcos's world of hard politics and diplomacy. "I've been told your services could offer me some insight," Arcos said without preamble, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "I have a decision to make, one that could affect millions of lives, and I need to be certain I'm making the right choice." Zane could sense the coldness in Arcos's demeanor, the way his words felt measured, calculated. He had no interest in personal healing, no desire to connect with his emotions. For Arcos, this journey was a strategic move, a way to gain an advantage. "You understand that this isn't a tool for decision making," Zane said calmly. "The soul bridge offers connection. Insight, yes, but it's about feeling, not just thinking." Arcos waved a dismissive hand. "Spare me the philosophy. I need to see what's beyond, what those alien species know that I don't. That's all." Zane hesitated. This was not how the journeys were meant to be used, but he couldn't deny the pull of curiosity. Perhaps Arcos would find something unexpected, something that would force him to confront his own arrogance. "Very well," Zane said finally, gesturing to the soul bridge. "Sit down, close your eyes, and let go of your preconceptions." Arcos didn't seem impressed, but he complied, sitting stiffly across from Zane. The device activated with its familiar hum, the room filling with the faint glow of its energy. Zane closed his eyes, expanding his consciousness outward, guiding Arcos into the presence of the Australiths. The Australiths were beings of pure intellect, their form shifting and fluid, like luminous clouds of thought. There were no emotions in their presence, no warmth or comfort, only the cold, clear logic of existence. Zane felt the connection deepen, and he sensed Arcos's mind reaching out, eager for the knowledge these beings could offer. As they entered the Australith's realm, Arcos was confronted with concepts far beyond human understanding. The aliens communicated through a complex web of abstract ideas and mathematical formulas, ethical dilemmas, and projections of possible futures. Zane could feel Arcos's sharp mind grappling with the influx of information, trying to make sense of it all. The Australiths were indifferent to Arcos's quest for power. They showed him the vastness of the universe, the insignificance of individual ambition in the grand scheme of things. They presented him with a future in which his political decisions would have ripple effects across generations, not in the way he expected, but in ways that would harm the very people he sought to control. Zane sensed the first flicker of doubt in Arcos, a subtle shift in his mind as the weight of the Australith's knowledge settled on him. The politician had come seeking answers, but the truth was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The Australiths showed him that the path he was on would lead to destruction, and not just for his political rivals, but for himself. When the journey ended, Arcos's eyes snapped open, his face pale and drawn. He stood abruptly, brushing off the lingering sensation of the Australith's presence as if it were something he could shake free. "This is nonsense," he muttered, but there was a tremor in his voice. "I don't believe it." Zane said nothing. He didn't need to. The journey had already planted the seed of doubt, and whether Arcos acknowledged it or not, it would grow. The politician left without another word, but Zane knew he would not forget what he had seen. As the door closed behind Arcos, Zane exhaled, feeling the tension in the room dissipate. The Australith's realm had been a stark contrast to the warmth of the Seraphorians, and the journey had left Zane feeling unsettled. He had seen the flicker of doubt in Arcos, the brief moment when the man's confidence had faltered. But Zane also felt the growing discomfort within himself. The journeys were becoming harder for him to bear, each one pulling him deeper into his own unresolved emotions. That night, Zane lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling as his mind raced. The connection with these Chaliths had stirred something in him, a recognition that he had been avoiding his own soul for far too long. He had always been the guide, the one who led others through their pain, but he had never allowed himself to confront his own. The thought of facing it terrified him. Days passed, and Zane continued his work, guiding clients through their journeys. But the growing sense of unease never left him. He found himself thinking more and more about his own unspoken wounds, the pain he had buried beneath years of guiding others. He was haunted by the idea that he was nothing more than a facilitator, helping others heal while he remained broken. Then came the message from the Crithraxians. The Crithraxians were a dying species, their numbers dwindling as their planet fell into environmental ruin. They had reached out to Zane's organization with an urgent request that they wanted to pass on their knowledge and wisdom through a final soul journey before their species vanished completely. It was a rare and momentous opportunity, one that would leave a lasting imprint on the collective consciousness of humanity. The Crithraxians were known for their intense emotions, their energy powerful and overwhelming. Many had warned that a connection with them could be dangerous for those unprepared to handle the weight of their sorrow. Zane was chosen to lead the journey. He felt the weight of the responsibility immediately, the enormity of what he was being asked to do. The Crithraxians were a species on the brink of extinction, their grief and fear all-encompassing. To connect with them would mean confronting emotions more intense than anything he had ever experienced before. And yet, deep down, Zane knew this was his moment. This was the journey he had been avoiding, his own confrontation with fear, with loss, with vulnerability. He spent the night before the journey pacing his room, his mind swirling with doubt and anxiety. His colleague, Cayenne, had offered words of encouragement, but even that had done little to ease the storm within him. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't sure he could face it. When the time came, Zane sat alone in his room, the soul bridge glowing faintly before him. He closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest as he activated the device. The connection was immediate, a rush of energy that pulled him deep into the Crithraxians' collective consciousness. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The Crithraxians' energy was raw, powerful, and overwhelming. Their sorrow hit him like a tidal wave, flooding his mind with their pain, their fear of extinction, their anger at the universe for allowing their species to die. Zane felt himself being swept away in the flood of emotion, drowning in their grief. For a moment, he considered breaking the connection. The intensity was too much, he wasn't ready for this. But then, amidst the chaos, something shifted. Zane felt a familiar sensation, a flicker of recognition. The Crithraxians' sorrow mirrored his own. In their grief, Zane saw himself. He had been running from his own pain for so long, burying it beneath his role as a guide, pretending that he was above it. But the Crithraxians' raw, unfiltered emotions forced him to confront the truth. He wasn't just a guide, he was a wounded soul, just like the people he had been helping. Tears filled Zane's eyes as he allowed himself to feel, truly feel, for the first time in years. The Crithraxians' sorrow became his own, their fear of extinction echoing his own fear of being lost, forgotten. He had spent so long hiding behind his role, afraid to confront the parts of himself that were broken. But now, there was no hiding. The Crithraxians' energy surged around him, and Zane let himself be swept away, not in fear, but in acceptance. He wasn't just here to guide them, he was here to heal, just as they were. The connection deepened, and Zane felt the Crithraxians' wisdom flow into him, their final message to the universe, a message of resilience, of survival beyond the physical form. As the journey came to an end, Zane opened his eyes, his face wet with tears. He felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his soul. The Crithraxians' legacy would live on, their knowledge preserved through the soul bridge, but more importantly, Zane had finally allowed himself to heal. For the first time in years, He felt whole. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The shuttle broke through the thick atmosphere of Asteris 4, streaking across the sky like a meteor. Inside, Dr. Ethan Gray gripped the armrests of his seat, feeling the familiar pressure of gravity returning. He stared out the window, watching as the planet's surface came into view, gray, cracked, and lifeless, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Once, it had been a paradise. Now, it was just another war-torn wasteland. "You okay, Doc?" A voice crackled through the comm. Ethan turned to see Sergeant Vance, the mission's head of security, glancing at him from across the cabin. Vance was the kind of guy who had seen more combat than most people could imagine and wore his scars like badges. His easy grin was the only thing that hadn't been hardened by years of war. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice dry. "Just a broken bar thinking about the reboot?" "About everything." Vance nodded, as if he understood, though Ethan doubted anyone could truly grasp the weight he carried. The shuttle rattled as it descended, the turbulence growing stronger as they neared the surface. Ethan's mind wandered back to the countless reports, the endless data. A planet that reboots itself. A natural wonder, perhaps the last of its kind, able to reset not just its environment but the people who live there. He hadn't believed it at first. Who would? But the evidence had been irrefutable. Ancient ruins that vanished and reappeared with every cycle. Plant life growing back overnight. And then there were the people, those rare survivors who'd experienced the reboot firsthand and emerged. A broken bar changed. The shuttle landed with a jolt, and the crew inside unbuckled. Ethan stood up, his body stiff, and grabbed his pack. The others were already moving. Lana Price, the biologist, was tapping furiously at her tablet, muttering something about preliminary readings. Ethan couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. She reminded him of himself, once. Before all the cynicism and loss had taken hold. They stepped out into the barren landscape, the sky a dull, sickly orange. Dust swirled around their feet as they made their way toward the research base, a small outpost that had been constructed by the initial survey team. It looked just as empty and abandoned as the planet itself. "Welcome to paradise," Vance muttered under his breath. Ethan let the comment slide, focusing instead on the task at hand. His team had come to Asteris 4 with a single mission: to unlock the mystery of the planet's reboot cycles. There was hope that understanding how the planet could heal itself might offer a solution to other worlds ravaged by war. But for Ethan, the mission was more than just a professional endeavor. It was personal. As they entered the base, the cold, metallic interior was a sharp contrast to the desolation outside. The hum of the air recyclers was the only sound. Ethan dropped his pack by the entrance and headed straight for the central console. The room flickered to life, holographic displays and data streams lighting up the walls. "Everything looks stable," Lana said, leaning over his shoulder. "The reboot hasn't started yet, but the signs are all there." "We're close," Ethan nodded, scanning the information. The planet's atmosphere was in flux, subtle shifts in pressure and temperature indicating the start of the next cycle. The reboots were unpredictable, occurring anywhere between decades to centuries apart. But once they began, the changes were rapid and all-encompassing. "Let's get to work," Ethan said, turning to his team. "We need to gather as much data as possible before the cycle begins." The hours passed in a blur of activity. Lana took soil and plant samples, while Vance and his security team patrolled the perimeter. Ethan monitored the environmental changes, noting the increasing levels of energy surging through the planet's core. It was as if the planet was preparing itself for rebirth. He glanced at the others, his mind drifting. They were all here for different reasons, some for scientific curiosity, others for fame or fortune. But for Ethan, it was about redemption. He'd lost so much over the years: his family, his sense of purpose. This mission was his last chance to find something that made sense in a universe that had gone mad. The first tremor hit just before midnight. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Ethan felt it in his bones. He stood up from the console and motioned to the others. "It's starting," he said quietly. They gathered around the central display as the ground beneath them rumbled again, stronger this time. Outside, the sky darkened, the orange hue giving way to a deep, unnatural red. The planet's surface began to crack and shift, as if something beneath the ground was waking up. Lana's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful." Ethan wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the way the planet transformed, as if it was erasing its history with every quake and tremor. Ruins that had stood for centuries crumbled to dust, rivers rerouted themselves, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and ozone. The team watched in awe as the landscape around them changed. Trees that had long since withered began to sprout anew, their leaves a vibrant green. Flowers bloomed where moments before there had been only dust. It was as if time itself was reversing. But the strangest part was how Ethan felt. It wasn't just the environment that was changing, it was him. He felt lighter, stronger, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His thoughts, usually clouded with doubt and regret, were clearer, sharper. "Do you feel that?" he asked, turning to Lena. She nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's like a broken bar, we're part of it. Like the planet is rebooting us too." Ethan's heart raced. This was what the survivors had described it as, the feeling of renewal, of being reborn alongside the planet. But as incredible as it was, he couldn't shake the sense of unease. What did it mean for them? Would they lose themselves in the process? The tremors subsided, leaving behind a transformed world. The once dead landscape was now teeming with life, but the sense of tranquility that followed was unsettling. It was as if the planet had reset, wiping away the scars of war and time. Yet something deeper remained, an ancient force, perhaps, that had orchestrated the reboot. Over the next few days, the team worked tirelessly, gathering samples and running tests. Ethan spent hours poring over the data, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how much information they collected, the answers remained elusive. "We're missing something," Lana said one evening as they sat around the base's common area. "The planet isn't just healing itself, it's healing us." Ethan looked up from his notes. "What do you mean?" "I've been running bioscans," she explained. "Our cells are regenerating faster than normal. Old injuries are disappearing. Even our mental states are improving." Vance said his nightmares have stopped. Ethan frowned. He hadn't noticed it at first, but she was right. His old knee injury, the one that had plagued him for years, was gone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the constant ache in his chest, the grief, the anger had faded. "What if this is the planet's way of ensuring its survival?" Lana continued. "It doesn't just reboot the environment, it reboots everything, including the people who live here." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. If the planet could reset them, erase their pasts, what did that mean for their futures? Would they even be the same people by the time the reboot was complete? Ethan pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. There was still so much they didn't understand, and with every passing day, the planet's changes grew more extreme. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The base was quiet, but outside, Astris 4 was alive with transformation. Every hour brought new changes to the landscape. What had been barren just days ago was now teeming with alien flora. The once polluted rivers ran clear, and strange, glowing fungi sprouted along the edges of the base. The planet's natural rhythm was a constant hum in his mind, as if Astris 4 was whispering to him, urging him to let go. He sat alone in the common area, staring at the holographic display of the data they'd collected so far. No matter how much information they gathered, it all pointed to the same conclusion: the planet wasn't just rebooting itself, it was fundamentally altering them too. He'd felt the effects already, the physical rejuvenation, the emotional clarity, but it wasn't until Lena had pointed it out that he truly understood the gravity of what was happening. The door to the common area slid open, and Vance walked in, his heavy boots barely making a sound on the metal floor. "Can't sleep either," Huh? Ethan shook his head. Too much on my mind. Vance grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and sat down across from him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was comfortable, almost peaceful. Vance had always been the grounding force in the team, a steadfast, reliable, the kind of man who took things as they came. But even he was starting to show signs of change. You ever think about what comes after this? Vance asked, breaking the silence. I mean, what happens when we leave? Ethan didn't answer right away. He'd been avoiding that question for days. The longer they stayed, the more it felt like leaving was impossible. Not because they couldn't, but because Asterisk 4 wouldn't let them. The planet had its grip on them, subtly changing their perceptions, their emotions, making it harder to imagine life outside its influence. I don't know, Ethan finally said. It's hard to say what we'll be like when we go, but I don't think we'll ever be the same. Vance nodded thoughtfully, taking a long sip of water. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. I've been carrying a lot of baggage for a long time. Feels like this place is giving me a chance to drop it. Ethan understood what he meant. The weight of his past had been a constant presence in his life for years, but now, here on this strange planet, it felt a broken bar lighter. The memories were still there, but they didn't hurt as much. It was as if Asterisk 4 had scrubbed the edges off his grief, leaving only the lessons he'd learned. Lana appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled, eyes wide. You guys need to see this. They followed her outside, into the cool night air. The planet's 2 moons hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the transformed landscape. But it wasn't the moons or the glowing plants that had her so worked up. In the distance, a massive structure had emerged from the ground, towering above the trees like a monument to a forgotten age. It wasn't there yesterday, Lana said breathlessly. I checked the satellite images. It's like the planet just a broken bar grew it. The structure was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was composed of smooth, metallic surfaces that shimmered under the moonlight, and strange symbols similar to the ones they'd seen in the ancient ruins were etched into its sides. It was both alien and familiar, like a relic of a time long past, yet somehow connected to the present. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at the structure. This was it, the missing piece they'd been searching for, the key to understanding Asterisk 4's reboot process. We need to get a closer look, he said, already moving toward the transport vehicle. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Vance and Lana followed without hesitation. Within minutes, they were driving toward the structure, the vehicle's lights cutting through the thickening fog that clung to the ground. The air grew colder the closer they got, and an inexplicable sense of anticipation buzzed in the back of Ethan's mind. When they reached the base of the structure, they stepped out of the vehicle, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, newly grown earth. Up close, the tower was even more impressive. It stretched high into the sky, disappearing into the clouds, and the symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic glow. It feels her broken bar alive, Lana whispered, reaching out to touch the metal. Her fingers hovered just above the surface, as if afraid to make contact. Ethan felt it too. The structure wasn't just a remnant of the pasta, it was an active part of the planet's ecosystem, a living, breathing component of Asterisk 4's mysterious power. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the metal. It was cool to the touch, but there was a subtle vibration, like a pulse, thrumming beneath the surface. Suddenly, the symbols flared to life, casting the area in a soft, golden light. The ground beneath them rumbled, and a doorway appeared in the side of the structure, seamlessly opening as if inviting them inside. What the hell? Vance muttered, taking a step back. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't turn away. This was what they'd been waiting for. The answers they needed were inside that structure. He glanced at Lana, who looked just as mesmerized as he felt. I'm going in, he said. Vance hesitated for a moment before nodding. I've got your back. The three of them stepped through the doorway, the air inside cool and still. The walls were lined with the same glowing symbols, casting just enough light for them to see the interior. The hallway stretched out before them, curving upward in a gentle spiral. They moved cautiously, the silence only broken by the soft hum of the structure. As they ascended, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by something physical, but by the planet itself. It was as if Asterisk 4 was guiding them, showing them what they needed to see. When they reached the top, the hallway opened into a large chamber. At the center was a massive, crystalline structure, pulsating with energy. It floated above the ground, suspended by some unseen force, and the symbols on its surface shifted and changed, as if reacting to their presence. Lana approached it slowly, her eyes wide with awe. "This is a broken bar, this is it. This is the core of the reboot." Ethan felt a wave of understanding wash over him. The planet's power wasn't just natural, it was controlled, directed by this crystalline core. It was the reason the planet could heal itself, the reason it could reboot everything, even the people who lived here. But as he stared at the core, a new realization dawned on him. The reboot process wasn't perfect. It wasn't just erasing the past, it was rewriting it. And with every reboot, something was lost. Memories, identities, entire histories were being wiped away, replaced with something new. He took a step back, his mind racing. "We need to leave." "Now?" Lana looked at him, confused. "What?" "But we've just It's not safe," Ethan interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. "This planet isn't just rebooting itself, it's changing us. If we stay here any longer, we won't be the same people we were when we landed." Vance's expression hardened. "You think the planet's trying to reset us?" Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. "Yes. And if we don't get out before the next reboot, we'll lose everything that makes us who we are." Lan hesitated, glancing back at the core. "But the data." "Screw the data," Vance said, stepping between her and the core. "Ethan's right. We're leaving." Reluctantly, Lana nodded, and they hurried back down the spiral hallway, the structure around them thrumming with energy. As they stepped outside, the ground beneath them shook violently. The reboot was beginning again, faster and more intense than before. They raced to the transport, the landscape around them shifting and changing with alarming speed. Trees grew and withered in seconds, the sky flickered between day and night, and the ground cracked and reformed beneath their feet. "Go, go, go!" Vance shouted as they piled into the vehicle. Ethan floored the accelerator, the vehicle lurching forward as the world around them continued to transform. The base came into view just as another tremor rocked the ground, sending cracks spidering across the earth. They reached the shuttle just in time. The engines roared to life, and they lifted off, leaving the rapidly changing planet behind. As they broke through the atmosphere, Ethan watched Asterisk 4 shrink into the distance, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they'd left behind. The planet would continue to reboot, erasing and reshaping itself in an endless cycle. But for Ethan, one thing was clear: no matter how many times the planet reset, the people who had experienced its power would never be the same. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the year 2157, humanity had become increasingly reliant on technology, not just for daily convenience but for mental and spiritual growth. The world of business, politics, and even personal development was deeply entwined with advanced inventions. Among the most revolutionary was the cosmic meditation pod, a device capable of connecting the human mind with the vast energy field of the universe. People used it to unlock hidden potential, find clarity in times of crisis, and sometimes just to escape the noise of a chaotic world. Alex Hargrove, once a titan in the tech industry, had fallen hard, and as he sat in the sterile silence of his penthouse, he found himself wondering if the pod could offer him a way out of the darkness. Alex wasn't always this lost. In his mid-40s, he had built an empire on innovative software solutions, predicting market trends, and capitalizing on AI-driven technologies. His company, Aegis Tech, was a juggernaut, a household name synonymous with cutting-edge security systems and AI integration. But the world of tech was volatile. A few bad investments, a couple of rushed projects, and a new competitor with deeper pockets and better marketing, had led to a catastrophic collapse of his business. The investors fled, his reputation took a nosedive, and Alex went from being a revered CEO to a cautionary tale in the business world. Now, Alex sat alone in his high-rise apartment, watching the city sprawl beneath him, the lights twinkling like stars too distant, too far removed from his reality. He had tried everything to claw his way back: personal coaches, therapists, even some of the newest neuroenhancement drugs. Nothing worked. The pressure of his failure weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into despair. At night, his mind raced, reliving the mistakes, the boardroom betrayals, the loss of his team. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. It was Marissa who first mentioned the cosmic meditation pod. She had been a colleague at Aegis Tech, one of the few who hadn't abandoned him when the company fell apart. Marissa had been using the pod for months and swore by its ability to provide clarity and insight. She believed in its power to help him, too. At first, Alex had scoffed at the idea. Meditation? Tapping into the cosmic energy field? It sounded like a gimmick, some new age nonsense disguised as tech. But desperation has a way of making even the most skeptical man reconsider. You don't have to do it alone, Marissa had said over drinks one evening. The pod won't fix everything overnight, but it might give you the perspective you need. It helped me, and I wasn't exactly in a great place either. Alex had hesitated, but the next day, he found himself in the showroom of the pod manufacturer, being given a demonstration. The sleek, egg-shaped device was larger than he expected, designed to accommodate a person lying down. Its interface was simply a padded interior with sensors built into the walls, a visor that covered the user's eyes, and a voice-activated control system that walked the user through each session. Once inside, the pod guided the user into a deep meditative state, tapping into brainwave frequencies that aligned with the natural rhythms of the universe. Or so the marketing claimed. Think of it as tuning yourself to the cosmos, the saleswoman explained. Our consciousness is part of the larger energy field that surrounds us. The pod helps you synchronize with that field, and the results can be profound. Alex remained skeptical, but he agreed to give it a try. He had nothing left to lose. The first session was disorienting. Lying inside the pod, Alex felt a strange mix of claustrophobia and serenity. The visor descended over his eyes, and he was bathed in darkness. A soft voice guided him through breathing exercises, instructing him to focus on the rise and fall of his chest, the rhythm of his breath. Slowly, the tension in his body began to melt away. The voice instructed him to let go of his thoughts, to stop clinging to the past, to the mistakes he had made. Alex tried, but the images of his failure still crowded his mind. Then, the voice changed, and something else happened. A low hum began to vibrate through the pod, resonating in his bones, in his core. As the hum grew louder, Alex felt himself being pulled into a deeper state of consciousness. The pod's visor, now glowing faintly, began to project faint patterns of light shapes that swirled and coalesced into something that felt both familiar and alien. The sensation was unlike anything Alex had experienced before. He felt like he was floating, weightless, disconnected from his body but still aware of his existence. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. Then, without warning, he was pulled into a vision. He stood on the edge of a vast desert, the sky above him swirling with colors he had never seen: deep purples, fiery reds, and electric blues. In the distance, towering mountains loomed, but they didn't look like mountains made of rock. They pulsed with light, shifting and shimmering as if they were alive. As Alex gazed at them, a voice, not the voice from the pod, but something deeper, more primal, spoke inside his mind. This is the cycle of creation and destruction. All things rise, all things fall. What was once powerful becomes dust. What is dust will become powerful again. The vision shifted. Now he was in a boardroom, his old boardroom at Aegis Tech. He saw himself sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by his team. They were discussing the next big project, the one that had failed so spectacularly. He heard himself speak, confident and determined. But from this new perspective, he saw the cracks in his plan, the arrogance in his voice. He hadn't listened to the warnings, hadn't considered the risks. It was painful to watch. The vision dissolved, and Alex was back in the desert. The voice returned. You must let go of what was. Only then can you become what you are meant to be. When the session ended, Alex emerged from the pod feeling drained but also strangely light. For the first time in months, his mind wasn't racing. The failures still existed, but they no longer defined him. He had always clung to the past, to the image of himself as a successful CEO. But the vision, the desert, the voice, it had shown him that everything was part of a cycle. Success, failure, growth, decline. He couldn't control it all. He could only learn from it and move forward. Over the next few weeks, Alex made the pod a regular part of his routine. Each session brought new insights, deeper connections to the cosmic energy field. The visions became clearer, more profound. He saw not just his past but glimpses of possible futures, paths he could take, decisions he needed to make. The more he used the pod, the more his confidence returned. Needed not the blind, ego-driven confidence he had once had, but a quieter, more resilient strength. He started to rebuild. At first, it was small things, reaching out to old colleagues, making amends with those he had wronged in his fall from grace. Then, as his clarity grew, he began to sketch out ideas for a new venture. This time, it wouldn't be about chasing profit or trying to outdo competitors. It would be about creating something that mattered, something that could help others, just as the pod had helped him. Alex's new company, NovaMind, was centered on developing mental wellness technologies, expanding on the ideas behind the cosmic meditation pod but making them more accessible to the average person. He worked tirelessly, but this time it didn't feel like a race. He was building something with purpose, something that aligned with his newfound understanding of the universe's rhythms. Just as NovaMind was gaining traction, a new challenge emerged. A larger competitor, Neurocorp, began launching a smear campaign against Alex's company, accusing him of unethical practices, trying to paint him as the same greedy CEO who had driven Aegis Tech into the ground. The accusations were baseless, but they were damaging. Investors grew wary, and NovaMind's stock took a hit. In the past, Alex would have panicked, would have scrambled to counter the attacks with aggression, throwing money at the problem in hopes of silencing his detractors. But he had learned better now. Instead of reacting impulsively, he returned to the pod. Inside the cosmic meditation pod, Alex felt the familiar hum resonating deep within him. The world outside, his worries about Neurocorp, the potential collapse of NovaMind, all of it faded. He took a deep breath, following the guidance of the pod's voice, letting his consciousness drift deeper into the universal energy field. The visions returned, clearer now, almost like memories of a life he had yet to live. He was standing on a cliff overlooking a vast ocean, its waves crashing rhythmically against the rocks below. The horizon stretched endlessly, and the sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The voice that had spoken to him before returned, but this time it felt more personal, more connected to his own thoughts. Every challenge is an opportunity to adapt, to grow. The waves do not fear the shore, they meet it with grace and persistence. You must do the same. Alex focused on the waves, watching as they surged forward, met resistance, and receded only to return again. He understood now. Neurocorp's attacks were just another wave, another obstacle that, if met with patience and strategy, could be overcome. He wasn't that reckless, ego-driven CEO anymore. The pod had helped him reshape his mindset, and now, standing on this metaphorical cliff, he realized how much he had changed. The universe itself was a teacher, and the lessons it imparted weren't always easy, but they were necessary. When the session ended, Alex opened his eyes, blinking as the dim light of his apartment came back into focus. The clarity remained. He wasn't going to react with anger or desperation. That was the old Alex. This time, he would lean into the challenge, not fight against it. He left the pod, grabbed his tablet, and immediately started strategizing. Neurocorp's smear campaign was targeting his past, trying to associate him with the failure of Aegis Tech. Alex knew that although he wasn't that person anymore, but public perception could be tricky. He had to show people, investors, and the market that Novamind was different, that he was different. He decided to take a bold step, one that the old Alex would never have considered: transparency. The following morning, Alex called a press conference. His PR team had advised against it, warning that it could backfire, that addressing the accusations directly would only give them more weight. But Alex trusted his instincts, or rather, the instincts he had honed through his meditative sessions. He knew this was the right move. The press room was packed. Journalists, industry insiders, and even a few former Aegis Tech employees filled the space, eager to see how Alex would handle the growing scandal. He stepped up to the podium, calm and composed. The lights from the cameras flashed, and a low murmur of conversation fell to silence as he began to speak. "I'm not here to deny the accusations being thrown at me," Alex said, his voice steady. "I'm here to address them head on, because the truth is, yes, I failed. My last company collapsed, and I made mistakes, big ones. But failure is not the end. It's part of the process. It's how we learn, how we grow." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room remained silent, but there was a shift in the energy. People were listening. "I've spent the last year rebuilding, and not just my career, but myself. The Cosmic Meditation Pod helped me understand something crucial. Failure isn't something to be feared or hidden. It's something to be embraced." Novamind was born out of that understanding. "We're not just another tech company. We're here to help people connect with themselves, with the universe, to find clarity and purpose, just as I did." Alex spoke for another 15 minutes, outlining his vision for Novamind, explaining the company's mission to create technology that enhanced mental wellness and self-discovery. He was candid about his past failures, but he made it clear that those failures had shaped the success he was building now. By the time he finished, the mood in the room had shifted. The skepticism had given way to something more hopeful, more understanding. The press conference was a turning point. Investors who had been on the fence reached out with renewed interest. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People weren't just interested in Novamind's products, they were inspired by Alex's story. His honesty, his willingness to confront his mistakes, made him more relatable, more human. Neurocorp's smear campaign quickly lost steam. Their attempts to paint Alex as a failure backfired, making him appear resilient and, in some ways, heroic. With the momentum on his side, Alex poured his energy into expanding Novamind. He hired a new team, many of whom had been with him at Aegis Tech before its collapse. Together, they developed new versions of the Cosmic Meditation Pod, making it more accessible to the average consumer. They launched a subscription model that allowed users to experience the pod in their own homes, with guided meditative journeys tailored to individual needs: stress relief, creativity enhancement, even physical rehabilitation. The results were astounding. Testimonials flooded in from people who had found solace, clarity, and even solutions to complex problems through the pod. As Novamind's success grew, Alex continued to use the pod himself, not as a crutch, but as a tool for ongoing growth. Each session brought new insights, new ways of looking at the world and his place in it. The universe, he realized, was constantly evolving, and so was he. The cycles of creation and destruction, of failure and success, would never end. But with each turn of the wheel, he grew stronger, more in tune with the rhythm of life. One evening, after a particularly intense session in the pod, Alex sat on his balcony, overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, but they no longer felt distant. He was part of it all now, connected to the city, to the people, to the universe itself. The sense of isolation he had once felt was gone. In its place was a deep sense of belonging, of purpose. Marissa joined him on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand. "You did it," she said, handing him the glass. "We did it," Alex corrected, smiling. "I wouldn't be here without your help." Marissa laughed. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You're the one who walked the path." Alex took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. He had come a long way from the man who had sat alone in his penthouse, consumed by failure. Now, he was someone else, yes, someone better. He had learned to let go of the past, to embrace the present, and to trust in the future. As the night deepened, Alex looked up at the stars. They seemed closer now, as if the universe was within reach. And in a way, it was. The cosmic meditation pod had shown him that the universe wasn't something out there, far beyond the grasp of ordinary humans. It was inside him, inside everyone, waiting to be discovered. The journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new failures, and new successes. But Alex knew he was ready for whatever came next. He had the universe on his side. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The dusty streets of Orbis 7 stretched out before Dr. Ethan Carter as he stepped out of the clinic. His eyes scanned the distant horizon, where the skyline of the colony met the dark, eternal night of space. The artificial domes, built to withstand the hostile environment of the planet, had once symbolized hope. Now, they loomed as a reminder of the challenges and hardship that the settlers faced daily. The colony had been on the decline for years, despite the technological marvel that kept them alive yet the light of life. Ethan had dedicated the better part of his career to this outpost, arriving at Orbis 7 with the idealism that had fueled many young doctors in the age of interstellar expansion. They had all come for different reasons, some for scientific discovery, others to escape Earth's growing political unrest. But Ethan had come to heal. It was his calling. Inside the clinic, patients waited some for routine treatments, others for emotional support. Trauma was rampant in the colony, as survivors of wars, family separations, and tragedies often found themselves stranded here, emotionally and physically shattered. Ethan couldn't count how many sleepless nights he had spent pacing through the halls, feeling the weight of his patients' anguish. Then there was the light of life, discovered beneath the surface of Orbis 7's ancient crust. The light of life had been hailed as a breakthrough. This mysterious energy source had incredible properties, not only sustaining the power grid and providing endless resources for the colony but also affecting human biology. Prolonged exposure seemed to slow aging, and early studies hinted that it could heal minor physical injuries. But what no one realized at first, or what Ethan himself had only recently discovered, was that the light could heal far more than just the body. It touched something deeper. The discovery came to him unexpectedly during a particularly trying shift. A young woman named Lydia had come into the clinic. She had been one of the early settlers, and the years had been hard on her. Her husband had died in a mining accident, and she had been left alone with 2 young children. The grief had consumed her, leaving her unable to care for them properly. She was a shell of the person she once had been. Ethan had tried everything: medications, counseling, even new Earth-based therapies. Nothing had worked. But that night, as he was preparing to discharge her, a strange thing happened. Lydia had been seated next to one of the light of life energy conduits. Her gaze was distant, locked in a stare that seemed devoid of hope. But then, something in her shifted. Her shoulders relaxed, and tears, a soft, silent tears, began to flow down her face. She hadn't cried since her husband's death. Ethan, stunned, watched as Lydia's breathing became more even. The grief that had once racked her entire being seemed to melt away, if only for a moment. He asked her how she felt, and her response startled him. "I feel a broken bar, like someone understands," she whispered. "Like I'm not alone anymore." It wasn't the first time someone had sat near one of the conduits, but it was the first time anyone had spoken about such an experience. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the light of life was more than just an energy source. There was something else at play, something emotional, perhaps even telepathic. But such ideas were far-fetched, and no one would believe him without proof. Ethan spent the following days quietly observing, watching how patients reacted when they were near the light. At first, he thought it might be a coincidence, a placebo effect at best. But more and more, he saw signs that something was happening. The colony's citizens, already living under immense psychological strain, were changing in subtle ways. They seemed to find solace in the presence of the light, especially those who had suffered the most. One evening, as Ethan conducted an experiment, something even more extraordinary occurred. He had been sitting alone in the research lab, a data pad in hand, trying to analyze the psychological impact of the light on his patients. The results were inconclusive, and frustration was beginning to creep in. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he placed his hand on the surface of one of the conduits. It was like a wave of warmth and understanding swept over him. The grief and exhaustion he had buried deep inside years of watching his patients suffer, of seeing lives ruined by war, tragedy, and despair came flooding to the surface. But instead of overwhelming him, it brought relief. He felt understood, as though an unseen presence was comforting him, reassuring him that he wasn't alone in this. Tears filled his eyes, unbidden. The experience was fleeting, but the impact was profound. For the first time, Ethan truly believed that the light of life wasn't just a power source. It was something far greater. It resonated with the human spirit, tapping into emotions, grief, and perhaps even hope itself. But how? Was it sentient? Could it communicate? Or was this all in his head? Ethan needed answers, but he knew that the colony's leaders would be skeptical. The light was their lifeblood, an energy source they couldn't afford to lose, especially as the colony's economy struggled to stay afloat. Any suggestion that it could affect human emotions would be seen as irrelevant, if not absurd. But Ethan couldn't let it go. He began documenting his findings in secret, careful to avoid raising suspicions. As weeks passed, he continued his experiments, working with patients who had experienced emotional trauma. Each time, he observed subtle but undeniable improvements in their mental states after exposure to the light. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was powerful, and Ethan suspected it could be life-changing if used correctly. However, not everyone in the colony viewed the light as a force for healing. As word of its properties spread, a faction within the colony began to push for the commercialization of the energy. Led by an ambitious businessman named Marcus Lang, this group saw the light of life as a commodity resource that could be sold to the highest bidder, especially to other struggling colonies. They argued that the colony needed the money and that the light was their ticket to survival. Ethan despised the idea. He knew that monetizing the light would lead to exploitation. Worse, he feared that overuse could have dangerous consequences. The light was unpredictable, and the emotional responses it triggered weren't always positive. Some patients had experienced intense emotional surges, from overwhelming sadness to euphoria. If misused, it could drive people to madness or worse. Lang and his faction weren't interested in Ethan's warnings. They saw only profit, and soon they began lobbying the colony's council to privatize the energy. Protests erupted in the streets as rumors spread that the light would be rationed and sold. Many colonists had come to depend on it, not just for physical survival, but for emotional stability. Losing access to it felt like a death sentence. As tensions mounted, Ethan found himself drawn into the heart of the conflict. He wasn't a politician, nor was he a revolutionary, but he knew that he had to stop Lang's plan before it was too late. He gathered a small group of like-minded individuals, other doctors, patients who had benefited from the light, and even a few sympathetic members of the council. Together, they formed a resistance, determined to protect the integrity of the light. The protests grew larger with each passing day. The colony was on the brink of collapse, and the emotional dependency on the light had reached critical levels. People began gathering outside the energy conduits, hoping to absorb its healing properties. But as the protest became more desperate, the mood shifted. Peaceful demonstrations turned into riots. Buildings were set ablaze, and the colony descended into chaos. Ethan stood in the chaos, watching helplessly as the protests spiraled out of control. The air was thick with smoke, and the streets were filled with panicked colonists, some desperate for a glimpse of the light of life, others driven mad by their dependence on it. He hadn't anticipated how quickly things would unravel, how deeply the colonists had come to rely on the energy. Now, they were losing their grip, both on the energy and on their emotions. Amid the chaos, Ethan knew he had to act. He couldn't stand by and watch the colony tear itself apart. He made his way through the frenzied crowd, his heart pounding as he pushed past those who had gathered near the conduits. The energy glowed faintly behind the barriers, and people clung to the hope that its mere presence could calm their turmoil. But Ethan knew it wasn't that simple. The light could heal, yes, but only if used with care, and the colony's leaders were exploiting it. As he reached the steps of the council building, he found Marcus Lang standing at the entrance, flanked by armed guards. The businessman's face was as cold and calculating as ever, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes as he surveyed the chaos. Ethan wasted no time. "This has to stop," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil around them. "You're pushing these people to the brink. If you keep this up, they'll destroy the colony and themselves." Lang's gaze hardened, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're naive, Doctor. You think this is about emotions? This is about survival. Without the light, this colony is finished. And if selling it is the only way to keep us alive, then so be it." Ethan stepped forward, undeterred. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The light isn't just an energy source. It's affecting people's minds, their emotions. If you commercialize it, if you start rationing it, you'll be playing with fire. People can't just be cut off like that." Lang raised an eyebrow. "And what's your solution? Give it away for free? Let the colony bleed itself dry until there's nothing left?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We need to regulate its use, carefully, responsibly. The colony needs time to adjust. People need time to understand what the light does, how it works. You're using it like a drug, and that's dangerous." Lang scoffed, shaking his head. "You're a fool, Carter. The colony needs leadership, not idealism. These people need to be controlled, not coddled." Before Ethan could respond, the crowd outside erupted into a roar. The sound of breaking glass filled the air, and a wave of colonists surged forward, their desperation palpable. The guards moved to intercept them, but it was too late. The barrier around the light of life conduit was torn down, and people flooded the area, their hands outstretched as they tried to absorb the energy. The raw intensity of their emotions collided with the power of the light, creating a volatile mix. Ethan's heart raced as he saw the effects. Those closest to the conduit began to weep uncontrollably, overcome by the flood of emotions the energy stirred in them. Others collapsed, their minds unable to process the overwhelming feelings. And still, more people pressed forward, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. "This is madness," Ethan shouted, turning to Lang. "You have to stop this." Lang hesitated for a moment, clearly shaken by the chaos unfolding before him. But his pride and his greed held him back. "It's too late," he muttered, backing away. "They've made their choice." Ethan knew there was no reasoning with him. He had to act now. Without thinking, he rushed toward the conduit, pushing through the throng of colonists as they clamored for a touch of the energy. His mind raced as he approached the glowing source of power. He could feel it, the pull of the light, the way it resonated with his emotions. But he had learned to control it, to understand it in a way few others had. He reached out, placing his hand on the conduit. The energy surged through him, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he could touch the minds of everyone around him. Their fear, their desperation, their hope, it all flooded into him, nearly knocking him off his feet. But he held on, focusing his thoughts, channeling the power of the light in a way he had never done before. Calm, peace. He projected the emotions outward, letting the light carry them to the minds of the colonists. Slowly, he felt the tide begin to turn. The panic in the crowd ebbed, replaced by a sense of collective calm. People began to step back from the conduit, their frantic movements slowing as they absorbed the soothing energy. Tears still flowed, but they were tears of release, not despair. Ethan could feel the strain on his mind, the effort it took to maintain the connection. But he couldn't let go, not yet. He needed to stabilize the situation, to show the colonists that they didn't need to rely on the light for emotional balance, yet that they had the power within themselves. As the crowd quieted, Ethan finally released his hold on the conduit, stumbling back as the connection severed. He was exhausted, but relief flooded through him as he saw the change in the people around him. The madness had passed, for now. Lang stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I stopped them from destroying themselves," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "And now it's time for you to do the right thing." Lang's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, a voice rang out from the council building. Counselor Amelia Strauss, one of Ethan's few allies, emerged, flanked by security personnel. She had witnessed everything, and the look on her face told Ethan that she understood. "Marcus Lang," Strauss said, her voice firm, "you are hereby relieved of your duties. The council will take over management of the Light of Life effective immediately." Lang sputtered in protest, but Strauss silenced him with a raised hand. "Your greed has endangered this colony for the last time. Dr. Carter is right. We need to protect the light, not exploit it." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes now fixed on Ethan. He felt the weight of their expectation, but also their gratitude. He had done what he could, but the future of the colony and the light would depend on what came next. In the weeks that followed, the colony slowly returned to a state of uneasy calm. The council implemented strict regulations on the use of the light, ensuring that it was used for healing and not profit. The riots had left scars, both physical and emotional, but there was hope now, a hope that the colony could rebuild, that they could find a way to coexist with the light without letting it consume them. Ethan continued his work, but now his role had changed. He was no longer just a doctor, he had become the colony's unofficial guardian of the light, the one who understood its power and its potential dangers. He worked closely with the council to develop new therapies that harnessed the energy's emotional resonance in safe, controlled ways. And as the years passed, Orbis 7 began to thrive once again. The colonists learned to live with the light, using it not as a crutch but as a tool for healing and growth. The fear and greed that had once threatened to tear the colony apart were replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. For Ethan, the journey had been long and difficult, but in the end, he had found what he had always sought: a way to heal, not just the body, but the soul. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the vast, star-studded expanse of the galaxy, peace had always been a fragile concept, held together by the thin threads of diplomacy and technology. The Interstellar Alliance, a conglomeration of star systems spanning countless light years, had once been the pinnacle of unity. Each system, regardless of species or origin, had a voice, a vote in the galactic network, the central hub of governance. Leaders were chosen not by bloodlines or conquest but by the will of the people, transmitted through the unbreakable web of technology. At least, that's what everyone believed. For years, the elections had run smoothly, and the alliance thrived. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. The smaller systems felt overshadowed by the larger, more resource-rich ones. Trade routes were monopolized, and wealth flowed unequally. It was only a matter of time before that discontent found a voice, a dangerous one. And so, when the time came to elect a new leader, the galaxy held its collective breath. Two candidates stood out among the rest. General Ray Vocaler, a seasoned diplomat known for her commitment to peace, and Valandreth, a rising star from a lesser-known star system, whose fiery speeches about independence and self-reliance stirred both admiration and fear. The election was set to be a historic moment. Billions of citizens, connected across the stars, prepared to cast their votes. But in the shadows, a plan was already in motion. A group known only as the Phantom Dawn had been biding their time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Their target, the galactic network itself. The attack came without warning. As the final votes were tallied, the galactic network suddenly flickered, then went dark for a brief, terrifying moment. When it came back online, the results were clear. Valandrat had won by a landslide. The galaxy was stunned. The numbers didn't add up, but there was no time for investigation. Within hours of being sworn in, Drat made his first move. Standing before the grand holographic assembly, his image beamed across every star system, he announced that the alliance was over. "The era of unity is dead," he declared, his voice cold and resolute. "From this moment forward, each star system will stand alone. We will no longer bow to the will of a corrupt, bloated alliance. Independence for all." The shockwaves were immediate. Star systems that had long depended on interstellar trade and cooperation were suddenly isolated. Diplomatic channels were severed, and the flow of resources ceased. Those who had benefited most from the alliance were plunged into chaos, while others, emboldened by Drat's words, prepared for war. Among the chaos, a lone figure sat in the cockpit of a small, weathered starship, watching the unraveling of the galaxy unfold on his screen. He was Callan, a mechanic and starship pilot who had spent his life maintaining ships for the Alliance's peacekeeping fleet. Now, as the universe around him collapsed into chaos, he found himself stranded on the outskirts of a crumbling star system. Callan stared at the screen, his heart heavy. He had seen the warning signs for years of the cracks in the system, the growing unrest. But he had never imagined it would come to this. The Alliance, once the beacon of hope and unity, was falling apart, and with it, the entire galaxy. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his mind racing. His home planet, now caught in the crossfire of the unfolding war, was no longer safe. His friends, his familia, they were all at risk. The starship he sat in, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a coffin drifting through the void. Callan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of incoming transmission beeps. He glanced at the console, recognizing the signal code. It was Nara, an old friend and fellow pilot. Without hesitation, he accepted the call. "Callan, where are you?" Nara's voice was urgent, filled with the same fear that had gripped the galaxy. "On the edge of the Traxxas system," he replied. "What's going on? Have you heard?" "More than heard," she said, her voice tight. "I'm stuck in the middle of it. The fleets are mobilizing. Planets are turning into battlefields. It's a complete war zone out here." Callan's chest tightened. "We need to get out. The Alliance is done, Nara. It's all falling apart." "I know," Nara said grimly. "That's why I'm calling you. There's a group of USA survivors, people who want to get away from this madness. We're trying to reach the outer rim, to find a place that's not caught in the war. We need someone like you, as someone who can keep our ships running." Callan hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had never been one to run from a fight, but this war a broken bar. It wasn't his fight. It wasn't anyone's fight. It was a massacre, and the longer they stayed, the more likely they were to be caught in the crossfire. "Where do you need me?" Callan asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "There's an old space station in the neutral zone, between the Valron and Sithis systems," Nara explained. "It's been abandoned for years, but there's a rumor that it still has a functional FTL ship. If we can get there, we can use it to escape the galaxy." Callan nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "I'm in. Send me the coordinates." The transmission ended, and Callan sat back, exhaling slowly. This was it. His chance to escape the madness, to find a way out. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The galaxy was at war, and getting to the space station would be a dangerous journey. Without wasting any more time, Callan powered up his ship's engines. The hum of the thrusters vibrated through the cockpit, and the stars outside the viewport blurred as the ship accelerated into the vast, chaotic void. As Callan's ship streaked through space, the scale of the conflict unfolding across the galaxy became painfully clear. Once bustling trade routes were now eerily silent, dotted with the wreckage of ships caught in the crossfire. Star systems that had thrived under the Alliance's protection were now battlegrounds, their surfaces scorched by orbital bombardment and the ceaseless exchange of high-tech weaponry. On the planets below, life had become a constant struggle for survival. Resources, once plentiful under the Alliance's shared system, were now scarce. Desperate factions, both large and small, fought over every scrap of fuel, every ounce of metal. Entire cities were leveled in the blink of an eye, reduced to smoldering ruins by the devastating power of the war machines unleashed upon them. Callan had seen enough of the devastation to know one thing: the Alliance was never coming back. The ideals of unity and cooperation that had once held the galaxy together were now just distant memories, shattered by greed, fear, and the hunger for power. As Callan navigated through the remnants of an asteroid field, his mind drifted to his own survival. He knew the journey to the neutral zone wouldn't be easy. With the collapse of the Alliance, the space between star systems had become a lawless wasteland, where pirates and mercenaries roamed freely, preying on any ship unlucky enough to cross their path. The warning lights on his console flashed suddenly, pulling Callan from his thoughts. His heart raced as the ship's sensors picked up multiple signals closing in on his position. Pirates! Callan cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls. His ship was fast, but it wasn't built for combat. He could outrun them, but only if he was smart about it. The pirates' ships appeared on his radar, small and agile, designed for quick strikes and fast escapes. They were gaining on him fast, their weapons systems locking onto his ship. Callan's pulse quickened as he plotted a course through the asteroid field, hoping to lose them in the dense, floating rocks. He pushed the thrusters to their limit, weaving through the asteroid field with practiced precision. The pirates followed, their ship starting between the asteroids, closing the gap with each passing second. Callan's eyes flicked to the readouts on his console. The pirate ships were too fast. He wasn't going to make it out of this unless he did something drastic. He glanced at the asteroid ahead, its surface pocked with deep craters. An idea formed in his mind, reckless and dangerous, but it was the only shot he had. With a deep breath, Callan adjusted his course, aiming straight for the asteroid. The pirates followed, their weapons locked onto his ship. At the last possible moment, Callan jerked the controls to the side, sending his ship into a sharp dive. The pirate ships, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, plowed into the asteroid's surface, their hulls shattering on impact. Callan exhaled in relief, his heart pounding in his chest. The danger had passed, but he knew it wouldn't be the last. The galaxy was a dangerous place now, and he was just one small ship in a sea of chaos. Callan adjusted his ship's trajectory, breathing heavily as the asteroid field faded behind him. The pirates had been close, too close, and he knew he couldn't afford many more encounters like that. The galaxy had turned into a violent place, where survival meant staying one step ahead of danger at every turn. His hands shook slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off, but there was no time to rest. He glanced at the coordinates Nara had sent him, recalculating his route toward the neutral zone and the abandoned space station that held their only hope of escape. The ship's autopilot hummed softly as it navigated the quiet, empty stretch of space. Callan leaned back in his seat, his mind drifting to thoughts of what lay ahead. He hadn't seen Nara in years, but their bond as pilots had always been strong. If anyone could lead a group through this chaos, it was her. He trusted her instincts and knew she wouldn't call him unless the situation was dire. The flashing console lights signaled an incoming transmission, pulling Callan from his thoughts. He hit the button, and Nira's face flickered onto the screen, her sharp features lined with stress. Behind her, the dim lights of a cramped ship interior illuminated several figures moving about. "We're getting close," Nira said, her voice tense. "But things are worse than we thought." I picked up some chatter from nearby systems that there's a new faction emerging, one that's taking advantage of the chaos to seize power. Callan frowned. "Who are they?" "Not sure yet. But they're organized, well-armed, and ruthless. They're calling themselves the Crimson Pact. From what I can tell, they're sweeping through systems, taking control of what's left of the major trade hubs. They've already captured several planets, and their fleets are moving fast." "How close are they to us?" "They're still a few systems away, but they're expanding fast. If we don't get to that space station soon, we could be cut off." Callan's stomach tightened. The last thing they needed was another warlord rising from the ashes of the Alliance's collapse. The Crimson Pact sounded like trouble, the kind that wouldn't stop until they had seized control of every resource-rich planet in the galaxy. "I am on my way," Callan said, his voice steady. "We'll make it." Nira nodded, though her eyes remained tense. "Just be careful, Callan. The closer we get, the more dangerous it's going to be." The transmission ended, leaving Callan alone with his thoughts once again. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control faster than he could keep up. The galaxy had become a battlefield, and every passing moment felt like the ground beneath them was crumbling away. Hours passed as Callan's ship made its way toward the neutral zone. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the ship's proximity alert. They were close. The space station loomed ahead, a massive, derelict structure floating in the emptiness. Its metal exterior was scarred and rusted, a relic of an era long gone. Callan guided his ship toward one of the docking bays, his eyes scanning the station for any signs of life. The place appeared abandoned, as Nira had promised, but something about the stillness unsettled him. He landed the ship with a soft thud, the docking bay's lights flickering to life as his engines powered down. He grabbed his toolkit from under the console and slung it over his shoulder before making his way out of the ship. The air inside the station was stale, thick with a smell of rust and decay. He could hear the faint hum of the station's power core struggling to keep the lights on. The rest of Nira's group was already there, waiting by one of the old cargo bays. Nira stood at the front, her arms crossed as she watched him approach. Behind her, a small crew of survivors. Some looked like seasoned pilots, others just scared civilians huddled together. They all wore the same expression, a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "You're late," Nira said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Ran into some trouble on the way," Callan replied. "Pirates." "But I lost them in the asteroid field." "Good," Nira said with a nod. "We've been scanning the station. It's mostly intact, but the FTL ship is in rough shape. We need you to take a look." Callan followed her into the cargo bay, where the rest of the group had gathered around an old, battered starship. It was larger than Callan had expected, a relic from a forgotten era of exploration. Its hull was covered in scorch marks, and several of its systems had clearly been scavenged for parts over the years. "She's seen better days," Nira said, gesturing to the ship. "But if we can get her up and running, she'll take us far away from here, somewhere the war can't reach us." Callan nodded, his eyes scanning the ship. It was a mess, but not beyond repair. The FTL drive would need serious work, but it was salvageable. If they could get the ship running, it could be their ticket out of the war zone. "I'll need some time," Callan said, pulling out his toolkit. "But I can get her flying again." As he worked on the ship, the station around them remained eerily quiet. The survivors kept watch, but there was an underlying tension in the air. They all knew that time was running out. The Crimson Pact was expanding, and it was only a matter of time before they reached this sector. Hours passed, and Callan lost himself in the familiar rhythm of repairs. His hands moved over the ship's damaged systems, rerouting power, replacing old wiring, and bringing life back into the ancient vessel. Slowly, The ship began to hum with renewed energy. But just as Callan was making progress, a distant rumble echoed through the station. He froze, his eyes flicking to Nora, who had gone pale. "What was that?" Callan asked, his heart pounding. Nora didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the far end of the cargo bay. "They've found us." Callan's blood ran cold. The Crimson Pact. Before they could react, the station's comms crackled to life, a distorted voice filling the air. "This is Commander Herrick of the Crimson Pact. The station is surrounded. Surrender now, and you may yet live." Nora cursed under her breath. "We need to move." Now. Callan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The ship was nearly ready, but they didn't have much time. The Crimson Pact's forces would breach the station any minute. He worked faster, sweat dripping down his forehead as he pushed the ship's systems to their limits. The others gathered around, tense and ready to fight if needed, though it was clear none of them wanted to face the Crimson Pact head-on. Their best chance was getting the ship operational and escaping before the enemy could break through. The rumble of footsteps echoed down the hallways as the Pact's forces drew closer. Callan could hear the distant hiss of their plasma rifles charging, the unmistakable sound of an impending battle. "Almost there," he muttered, his fingers moving rapidly over the control panel. The ship's engines roared to life, the power surging through the vessel. "Get everyone on board." Nora and the others wasted no time, rushing into the ship as Callan finished the final checks. The Crimson Pact soldiers were at the door now, their weapons raised as they prepared to storm the cargo bay. Callan slammed the control panel shut and darted for the ship's entrance just as the doors burst open behind him. Plasma fire filled the air, the bright blue bolts streaking past him as he dove inside the ship. "Go!" Nora shouted from the cockpit, her hands gripping the controls as the ship lifted off the ground. The docking bay doors slid open, revealing the vast, empty space beyond. Callan barely had time to strap himself into a seat as the ship rocketed out of the station, the Crimson Pact soldiers left behind in the chaos. The stars blurred around them as they accelerated away from the war-torn sector, the engines humming with renewed life. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of what they had just escaped settling over them. But Callan knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was still burning, and the Crimson Pact was still out there, hunting them. Nora glanced over at him, her expression grim but determined. "We made it." "For now," Callan nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. They had escaped the Crimson Pact this time, but the war was far from over. The galaxy had collapsed into chaos, and their survival would depend on staying one step ahead of the factions tearing it apart. As the ship's engines hummed beneath them, Callan stared out at the stars, wondering what kind of future awaited them in the unknown stretches of space. The Alliance was gone, but perhaps, somewhere out there, they could start again. Away from the war, away from the violence. But for now, all they could do was run. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet Zolara had always been resilient. Nestled in the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim, it had survived countless crises from resource shortages to political unrest. But this time felt different. The economy, once bolstered by mining and trade, had collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiencies. Jobs were scarce, people were desperate, and the government had no answers. The streets were filled with protests, angry citizens demanding change, as the candidates for the upcoming election promised just that, a change. On one side was Talon Vec, a former military commander turned politician. He was everything the people thought they needed: bold, strong, and unafraid to make the tough decisions. His campaign was a storm of fire and fury, and he promised what others dared not speak: war. War, he argued, would pull Zolar from the depths of its economic crisis. The neighboring star systems were rich with resources, and they were weak, ripe for the taking. All Zolara needed was the will to strike, and under his leadership, they would. His opponent, La Uramanan, was a voice of reason in an unreasonable time, a diplomat by trade, She spoke of cooperation and rebuilding alliances. She warned of the dangers of Talon's promises, of the lives that would be lost and the instability that would follow. But her words fell on deaf ears. The people were too tired, too angry, too eager for a quick fix. They didn't want patience, they wanted power. When Talon won the election in a landslide, the streets erupted in celebration. The people cheered, hailing him as the savior of Zolara. Laura could only watch in silence as the man who promised war took the reins of a planet on the brink. The first few months of Talon's rule were filled with fiery speeches and grand declarations. He wasted no time in assembling his military council, pulling together the most experienced officers and strategists Zolara had to offer. Chief among them was Commander Mechs, a man who had seen more battles than he cared to remember. Mechs was cautious, a soldier who knew the cost of war. But Talon, drunk on his newfound power, dismissed Mechs' warnings with a wave of his hand. "Our enemies are weak," Talon declared at one council meeting, pacing in front of the holographic map of the neighboring star systems. "The aliens are pacifists, they've never been tested in war. We'll crush them within weeks, and their resources will fuel Zolara's rebirth." Mechs kept his eyes on the map, noting the strategic locations Talon was eyeing. "The aliens may not have a large military, but they're not alone," he said carefully. "Their alliances run deep. If we strike, we'll be facing more than just one star system." Talon scoffed. "Allies? They're cowards. None of them will risk war for the aliens. We hit them fast and hard. By the time their so-called allies decide to act, it'll be too late." The council murmured in agreement, more out of fear of disagreeing with Talon than true confidence in his plan. Mechs could see it in their faces. But there was no stopping this train. The decision had already been made. And so, the war began. Zolaran ships, sleek and formidable, darkened the skies above Illyria within days. The aliens, a peaceful society with little experience in military defense, scrambled to defend their planet. But Talon was right about one thing. They were no match for the might of Zolara's fleet. Alien cities fell one by one, and their once bustling industries were reduced to smoldering ruins. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Talon's plan would work. The media back on Zolara spun the invasion as a glorious victory, a triumph of Zolaran strength over weakness. Talon's popularity surged as he paraded himself in front of the cameras, declaring that Zolara's future was secure. The people believed him. They had to. After years of struggle, they needed something to believe in. But behind the scenes, something far more dangerous was brewing. The aliens, desperate and outmatched, sent out a call for help, and their allies answered. The Galactic Coalition was born almost overnight. Star systems that had once been content to remain neutral now found themselves united by a common cause: stopping Zolara. The Coalition's military forces were vast, their technology superior, and they had no intention of letting Zolara's aggression go unanswered. The first signs of trouble came during the Battle of the Zarkam Nebula, a seemingly routine skirmish that quickly turned into a nightmare for the Zolaran forces. Commander Mechs, leading the fleet, watched in horror as the Coalition ships emerged from the nebula, their weapons systems far more advanced than anything Zolara had seen. The Zolaran fleet was decimated within hours. Mechs barely escaped with his life, his ship limping back to Zolara with news of the devastating defeat. He could see the fear in the eyes of his crew, soldiers who had never known defeat, now grappling with the reality that they were no longer the predators, but the prey. When Mechs reported the loss to Talon, the leader's reaction was predictable. He raged, throwing accusations and blaming everyone but himself. But beneath the fury, there was fear. For the first time since he had taken power, Talon realized that he had underestimated the enemy. But rather than retreat or seek diplomacy, Talon doubled down. He ordered the full mobilization of Zolara's forces, calling on every able-bodied citizen to join the war effort. Factories churned out weapons and ships at an unprecedented rate, and the planet was transformed into a war machine. Yet the more Talon pushed, the more the coalition pushed back. The war began to spread, engulfing star system after star system. What had started as a calculated invasion had now spiraled into an intergalactic conflict, with billions of lives at stake. Back on Zolara, the cracks in Talon's regime were beginning to show. The economy, which he had promised would rebound with the spoils of war, was now worse than ever. With so many resources diverted to the war effort, there was little left for the people. Food shortages became common, and the once celebratory crowds now turned into angry mobs, demanding answers. Talon responded with force. He declared martial law, deploying the military to quell the unrest. Protests were met with violence, and anyone who spoke out against the war was branded a traitor and imprisoned. The media, once a willing partner in Talon's propaganda, now found itself under strict government control, forced to report only the glorious victories of Solari's forces, of victories that were becoming fewer and farther between. Laura Manon, who had been largely silent since her defeat in the election, now found herself leading a growing underground resistance. She had warned of this. She had told the people that war would only bring destruction, not prosperity. And now, as Solara crumbled under the weight of its leader's ambition, more and more people were turning to her for guidance. Her resistance movement was small at first, made up of former diplomats, disillusioned military officers, and citizens who had lost faith in Talon's regime. But it grew quickly. Meetings were held in secret, messages passed through encrypted channels. Laura knew that overthrowing Talon would not be easy, but it was their only hope if Solara was to survive. One of her most surprising allies was Commander Mechs. Mechs had always been a loyal soldier. His entire life had been devoted to serving Solara, protecting its people, and following the chain of command without question. But after the Battle of the Zarka Nebula, something in him had shifted. He had seen the cost of Talon's ambition firsthand: thousands of lives lost, fleets decimated, all for the illusion of power. Mechs wasn't blind to the desperation that had driven Talon to war, but now he could see the full picture. This wasn't a path to victory, it was a path to ruin. Meeting Laura Manon had been a gamble. If Talon's regime ever found out, he'd be executed for treason. But Mechs knew that Solara was on the verge of collapse, and the only way to save it was to remove Talon from power. Laura had the people's trust. Even if they had rejected her in the election, she represented the values that Solara had abandoned: reason, diplomacy, and hope. When Mechs approached her, the former diplomat had been cautious. They met in a small, dimly lit room hidden beneath the bustling streets of Solari's capital. Laura sat across from him, her eyes searching his face for signs of deception. "You're taking a great risk coming here, Commander," she said softly. "What makes you think I would trust you?" Mechs leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Because I'm the only one who can stop Talon." Laura studied him for a long moment, the weight of her decision clear in her eyes. "And why now? Why not before he started this war?" Mechs's jaw tightened. "Because I believed in him." "We all did, but I've seen the truth. He's leading us to destruction, and if we don't act now, it'll be too late." The air between them was tense, but there was a mutual understanding. They both knew that time was running out. Laura finally nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we stop him, together." The war raged on as Mechs and Laura carefully crafted their plan. Talon's regime was cracking under the pressure. The economy had all but collapsed, and the citizens of Solara were no longer content to be fed lies about glorious victories. The truth was leaking out. Their fleets were losing ground, their soldiers were dying in droves, and the coalition was closing in. Talon's paranoia grew with every passing day. He had surrounded himself with loyalists, silencing any dissent within his inner circle. The once celebrated war hero now ruled with fear, issuing decrees that only deepened the divide between the government and the people. But his iron grip on power was slipping. The final straw came when Talon announced Operation Final Dawn, a full-scale military strike against the coalition's capital system. It was a reckless plan, one that would push Zolara's already overstretched forces to their limit. The goal was simple: cripple the coalition's leadership and force them to negotiate on Zolara's terms. But Mechs knew better. This wasn't a strategic move. It was the act of a desperate man trying to cling to power. In secret, Mechs mobilized a rogue fleet. It wasn't large, but it was enough to intercept Talon's forces before they could carry out the strike. Laura's resistance had grown as well, with key members of the military and government joining their cause. Together, they would make their move. As Uldren ships prepared to launch Operation Final Dawn, Mechs' fleet struck first. It was a calculated assault, designed to cripple Talon's command structure without causing unnecessary bloodshed. The rogue fleet engaged Talon's forces near the outskirts of the capital system, and the battle that followed was fierce. Mechs fought with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Every maneuver, every order was calculated to minimize the loss of life, but there was no denying the intensity of the fight. Talon's loyalists fought hard, refusing to believe that their leader could be overthrown. But Mechs' forces had the element of surprise, and that gave them the upper hand. As the battle raged on, Mechs received word from Laura. The resistance had succeeded in capturing key government officials, and Talon's support was crumbling. It was time to end this. Mechs' flagship pushed through the thick of the battle, targeting the command ship where Talon himself was directing the operation. The comms lit up as Talon's voice filled the bridge. "Mechs, you traitor! You dare stand against me? I built this military, this empire. You think you can just take it from me?" Mechs' voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of steel in his tone. "This isn't your empire, Talon. It belongs to the people, and they don't want war anymore." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, bitter laugh. "You're a fool, Mechs. The people want strength. They need someone who will fight for them. You're just too weak to see it." Mechs didn't respond. Instead, he gave the order to disable Talon's ship. It didn't take long. With the coalition closing in on Zolara, the loyalists began to falter. Within hours, the battle was over, and Talon's regime had fallen. When the dust settled, Laura stood at the center of the capital's grand hall, addressing the citizens of Zolara. Her voice echoed through the crowd, filled with the weight of the past and the promise of a new future. "This war was a mistake," she said, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had suffered under Talon's rule. "But we can rebuild. We can choose a different path, a path of cooperation, of peace, and of hope. It won't be easy, and there will be many challenges ahead. But we will rise from this, stronger than before." The people listened in silence, their faces a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had been through so much, seen so much destruction, lost so many lives. The road to recovery would be long, but for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Laura knew that the fall of Talon was only the beginning. The damage had been done. The economy was in ruins, entire cities had been destroyed, and millions of lives had been lost across the galaxy. But there was still a chance to rebuild, to prove that Zolara could rise from the ashes. As she looked out over the crowd, her thoughts turned to Commander Mechs. He had played a pivotal role in stopping Talon's madness, but now he stood on the outskirts of the hall, his expression somber. He had seen the horrors of war up close, and though they had won the battle, the cost weighed heavily on him. Mechs caught her gaze and gave a small nod, as if to say that their work was far from over. Laura returned the gesture, knowing that they would need people like him, people who had seen the worst but still believed in something better. The galaxy would not forget what had happened. The war that had started with one man's ambition had spiraled into an interstellar conflict that left countless civilizations devastated. The Galactic Coalition, though victorious, was now tasked with picking up the pieces. And Zolara, once a proud and powerful planet, now stood as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. The democratic system that had elected Talon was in tatters. Many questioned whether democracy could survive in the aftermath of such a disaster. How could a system that allowed a man like Talon to rise to power ever be trusted again? But Laura believed in democracy. She believed in the people's ability to learn from their mistakes, to grow and change. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to restore Solari's faith in itself. As the sun set over the capital, Laura took a deep breath. There was much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so bleak. The price of power had been paid in blood and destruction, but from that devastation, there was a chancea, just a chancea, that something better could emerge. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the gleaming corridors of the Galactic Empire, the day of the elections arrived like a grand festival. Towering holoscreens broadcast the event to every corner of the Empire, showcasing the citizens' enthusiasm and the supposed exercise of democracy in action. On the surface, it was a display of unity and progress, a symbolic ritual to demonstrate the power of the people. But beneath the sheen of this spectacle, power remained firmly in the hands of the military and corporate elites. They had long since perfected the art of engineering these elections, controlling the results with precision while giving the masses the illusion of choice. And yet, on this particular election day, something went wrong. Jared Darlin, a man of simple origins, never expected to find himself in the middle of such turmoil. He had entered the race as a reformist, a grassroots candidate with a small but passionate following. His campaign platform was radical, at least by the Empire's standards. He called for wealth redistribution, breaking the stranglehold of the military-industrial complex, and opening up classified corporate contracts for public scrutiny. No one in power had ever taken him seriously. He was meant to be the token opposition of the figurehead to placate those who still believed in the democratic process. But when the final results came in, something unimaginable happened. Jared won. His victory was an accident, the result of an error in the complex algorithm the elites used to manipulate the votes. In their arrogance, the system they relied on had failed them, handing power to someone who wasn't meant to win. At first, there was stunned silence across the capital. In the grand hall where the results were being tallied, the elites sat in their luxurious seats, eyes widening in disbelief as the announcement echoed through the chamber. Jared's face, beamed across the Empire, looked equally stunned. He had never expected to win, and the realization of what this meant hit him like a tidal wave. The upper echelons of power, led by the shadowy coalition of corporate executives and high-ranking military officials, immediately convened a secret meeting. The glittering towers of Galactic Prime, the capital planet, shone in the night as they gathered in a secure location far from the public eye. General Vorta, the head of the Galactic Armed Forces, was the first to speak. His voice was a gravelly rumble, betraying the years of military campaigns he had overseen. This cannot stand. We cannot allow some idealist to dismantle everything we've built. If he gets control of the council, he'll expose everything. Beside him, Corwin Stratton, the CEO of the Empire's largest corporate conglomerate, nodded. His slick hair and expensive suit radiated an aura of arrogance, but beneath it lay a man who had built his empire by being ruthless. The people love him now, but that can change. We control the media. We've manipulated public perception before. We can do it again. But the problem, General Vorta cut in, is that he's not like the others. He's not corruptible. We've looked into him. He actually believes in his nonsense. He's not in it for wealth or power. Stratton leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Then we'll have to handle this the hard way. Meanwhile, Jared's first days in office were a whirlwind. He moved quickly, aware that his time was likely limited. His election was nothing short of a miracle, but he knew better than to believe in fairy tales. The forces arrayed against him were vast and powerful, and he could feel their eyes watching his every move. His first act was to fulfill a campaign promising transparency. He declassified records showing the government's close financial ties to the military and corporate giants. What had once been whispers on the fringes of the empire now became undeniable facts. The people, who had long felt oppressed by the system, were electrified. Protests erupted across major planets, calling for further reforms and an end to corporate control. Jared visited these planets personally, refusing the protection of a heavy security detail. He wanted to show the people that he wasn't just another puppet leader. Wherever he went, he was greeted by crowds chanting his name, their faces filled with hope. To them, he was the first real leader in generations. "I've spent my life on the outer colonies," Jared said during a broadcast to the entire empire, "where people are forgotten, and resources are siphoned off to fuel the luxury of the few. That ends today. Together, we will take back control of this empire. It belongs to all of us, not just a select few." The message resonated deeply with the working class citizens, those who had long been disenfranchised by the elites. For the first time in decades, they felt as though they had a voice. But in the pristine halls of Galactica Prime, the message was a declaration of war. General Vorta and Corwin Stratton wasted no time. They set their plan in motion, calling upon their vast resources to undermine Jared's authority. The media, once neutral or even supportive, began to change its tone. Stories of Jared's supposed radicalism flooded the empire. They painted him as a dangerous extremist, someone whose reckless policies would destroy the stability of the empire. His political opponents were bribed or blackmailed into turning against him. Even within his own administration, spies planted by the elites began to sabotage his efforts, creating internal conflict and inefficiencies. Still, Jared pressed on. He refused to be cowed by the opposition, but he could feel the weight of the empire's establishment bearing down on him. At night, in the solitude of his quarters, he would wonder if it had all been a mistake, yet if perhaps the empire was too far gone to save. One evening, after a long day of meetings and political maneuvering, Jared was walking through one of the quieter districts of the capital. He had chosen not to bring his security detail, wanting some time alone to think. The air was crisp, and the sky above was clear, filled with stars that stretched out endlessly into the void. It was peaceful until the explosion. A blast ripped through the street behind him, sending shock waves through the air. Jared was thrown to the ground, debris raining down around him. He lay there for a moment, dazed, as his ears rang from the impact. When he tried to stand, his vision blurred. But as the dust settled, he saw the unmistakable shapes of military vehicles pulling up, soldiers spilling out of them like ants. They weren't here to rescue him. Jared ducked into a nearby alley, his mind racing. This wasn't just an attack, it was an assassination attempt. He had known it would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it so soon. His only thought now was survival. As he weaved through the maze of streets, Jared's heart pounded in his chest. The military had made their move. If they were willing to kill him, it meant they were ready to go even further. 2 days later, the Galactic Armed Forces declared a state of emergency. General Vorta made the announcement in front of a packed council chamber, his stern expression projected across every screen in the Empire. He claimed that there had been a credible threat against the Empire's security. An external force, he said, was responsible for the recent assassination attempt on the Emperor-elect. For the safety of the people, it was necessary to temporarily suspend democratic processes. Jared watched the broadcast from his hidden refuge, jaw clenched in frustration. The military had taken full control, and with the media in their pocket, they spun the narrative perfectly. The public, still reeling from the assassination attempt, had no idea they were being lied to. They believed General Vorta's story. Fear gripped the empire, and in that fear, people were willing to give up their rights for security. Jared's supporters, however, weren't fooled. Across the empire, protests erupted. Citizens loyal to Jared, along with rogue factions of the military and former mercenaries, rose up against the coup. What started as a series of scattered skirmishes quickly escalated into all-out civil war. The once mighty galactic empire fractured, its planets turning into battlegrounds as pro-Jared forces clashed with the loyalists led by the military and corporate-backed regimes. Cities that had once been symbols of progress and unity were now scarred by conflict, their towering spires reduced to rubble. Jared, for his part, led his forces from the shadows. He knew he couldn't return to the capital, not yet. Instead, he rallied support on the outer colonies, places the Empire had long neglected. He found allies in unexpected places and Outer Rim warlords, who had once been enemies of the state, agreed to join his cause, seeing an opportunity to gain power in the chaos. Jared didn't like making deals with men like them, but he had little choice. The war was too far gone for idealism now. As the fighting intensified, another threat loomed on the horizon. Jared knew that the Empire's internal strife had not gone unnoticed by its neighbors. For decades, the Galactic Empire had kept alien empires at bay through sheer military might and diplomatic maneuvering. But with the Empire embroiled in civil war, its defenses weakened, and borders became porous. It was only a matter of time before the predators on the fringes of known space would strike. The first incursion came from the Zereth, an alien race long seen as opportunistic scavengers. Jared's forces, still struggling to consolidate their hold on the outer colonies, were among the first to encounter them. Reports came in from several border planets of Zereth warships entering Imperial space, plundering resources, and attacking settlements. The Empire's stretched military was too focused on the internal conflict to repel the invasion, and the Zereth took advantage of the chaos. Jared realized that this external threat could either be his undoing or his salvation. If he could rally his forces to fight off the aliens, he might win back the support of the people, showing them that he was the only one capable of defending the Empire in its time of need. But it would require a delicate balance. His forces were already stretched thin, and every battle against the Zereth would give the military loyalists more time to regroup. Still, there was no choice. Jared issued the call to arms, rallying his supporters and Outer Rim allies to defend the Empire against the alien threat. The conflict with the Zereth became a brutal war of attrition, fought across vast stretches of space and barren planetary outposts. Jared personally led many of the campaigns, his charisma and determination inspiring those under his command. His reputation as a leader grew, not just as a reformist, but now as a wartime commander. But even as Jared's forces gained ground against the Zereth, the internal conflict continued to rage. General Vorta and Corwin Stratton weren't about to let a few alien skirmishes derail their plans. Behind the scenes, they struck deals with more formidable alien empires, ones that had long been kept in check by the Galactic Empire's power. These empires, more sophisticated and dangerous than the Zereth, saw the Civil War as their opportunity to carve up the Empire for themselves. One such empire was of Orn Dominion, a race of highly intelligent and ruthless conquerors. They had remained neutral in the Empire's affairs for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, with the Empire on the brink of collapse, they seized the opportunity. Vorn fleets began appearing on the outer edges of Imperial space, not with the chaotic raids of the Zereth but with coordinated, methodical invasions. Entire planets fell under their control within days, their precision and technology far superior to what the Empire had seen in recent memory. Jared's forces, already depleted from the battles with the Zereth, were caught off guard by the Vorn assault. He quickly realized that this wasn't just a secondary threat. The Vorn intended to dismantle the Empire entirely. The Zereth had been a distraction, a nuisance that Jared could handle, but the Vorn were different. They were calculating, relentless, and far more powerful. As the war expanded on multiple fronts, Jared found himself forced into alliances he would have once considered unthinkable. Some of his closest allies urged him to sue for peace with the Vorn, to negotiate a settlement that would preserve at least part of the empire. But Jared refused. He knew that the Vorn wouldn't stop at a mere truce. They sought total domination, and any agreement with them would only serve to further weaken the empire. In the midst of this chaos, Jared's closest advisors began to fracture. Some believed that continuing the fight against both the Loyalists and the Vorn was a doomed effort. Others wanted to negotiate a ceasefire with the Loyalists to present a united front against the alien threat. Jared, however, saw both as enemies. He refused to compromise with the very forces that had sought to destroy him. But as the war dragged on, his idealism began to falter. The cost of the conflict was immense. Planets that had once thrived were now desolate war zones. Millions of lives were lost, and the empire's infrastructure crumbled. The once great empire that Jared had sworn to reform was now a shadow of its former self. Desperate for a breakthrough, Jared launched a daring operation deep into Vorn-controlled space. It was a high-risk mission, designed to strike at the heart of the Vorn Dominion's command structure. If successful, it could turn the tide of the war and buy Jared the time he needed to deal with the internal threat posed by the Loyalists. The mission was brutal. Jared and his team infiltrated a heavily fortified Vorn installation, fighting their way through advanced defenses and encountering the full fury of Vorn military technology. The casualties were heavy, and Jared found himself in the thick of the fighting, his leadership once again inspiring his troops to push forward despite the overwhelming odds. In the final moments of the mission, Jared faced a choice: he had destroyed the Vorn command center, but at the cost of his entire team, or retreat and regroup, preserving his forces for another day. For Jared, the choice was clear. He ordered the attack, knowing that it was the only way to cripple the Vorn's ability to continue their offensive. The ensuing battle was vicious, but ultimately, the command center was destroyed. The Vorn, for the first time in the war, were forced into retreat. But the victory came at a steep price. Jared's forces were decimated, and while the Vorn had been dealt a significant blow, the Loyalist forces under General Vorta and Corwin Stratton were now free to tighten their grip on the remaining Imperial strongholds. With his forces in disarray, Jared returned to the outer colonies, where the news of his victory over the Vorn had rallied the people once more. But despite their support, Jared knew that the war was far from over. The Empire was fractured beyond repair, and the alien threats still loomed. The Zereth, though weakened, continued their raids, and while the Vorn had retreated, they would return. Jared gathered his remaining advisors for a final meeting. The options were bleak. The Loyalists had retaken many key planets, and the Empire's economy was in shambles. The people, once inspired by his vision of reform, were now exhausted from years of war. "There's no way out of this," one of his advisors said grimly. "We can't fight them all." Jared remained silent, staring out at the stars. The Empire had been broken long before his election, but he had still believed in the possibility of change, in the promise of a better future. Now, he was no longer sure. "We keep fighting," Jared finally said, his voice steady. "But we fight for the people, not for the Empire." "The Empire is already dead." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The dream of reforming the Galactic Empire was over. Now, Jared was fighting to give the people a chance to survive in the chaos that had engulfed their world. As Jared prepared for what would likely be his final stand, news reached him that the Loyalists had captured one of his closest allies and were preparing for a public execution. It was a clear message. Jared's time was running out. With little choice, Jared made one final, desperate move. He sent a message to General Vorta, requesting a meeting under a flag of truce. To everyone's surprise, Vorta agreed. The meeting took place in the ruins of what had once been a grand imperial city, now reduced to rubble by the war. The two men faced each other across a barren landscape, the remains of their empire scattered around them. Jared, weary but unbroken, met Vorta's cold gaze. "It didn't have to be like this," Jared said, his voice calm. Vorta smirked. "You were always not a tilde Macron v. Jared, the people never wanted freedom. They wanted stability. They wanted order, and you took that away. And what have you given them in return? Jared asked, gesturing to the ruins around them. This, the Empire will rebuild, Vorta said dismissively. It always does. Jared shook his head. Not this time. Without warning, Jared detonated a hidden device, triggering an explosion that engulfed the meeting site. It was his final act of defiance, a message to the people that he would rather die than see the Empire continue under the corrupt rule of the elites. Jared Darlan's death sent shockwaves throughout the Empire. The Loyalists declared it a victory, but across the outer colonies, his name became a symbol of resistance. The Civil War continued, but now, it was no longer just about reforming the Empire. It was about survival in a galaxy that had turned its back on the very idea of democracy. In the end, Jared's vision of a better future died with him, but his legacy lived on. Scattered across the Empire, small bands of rebels carried on the fight in his name, determined to build something new from the ashes of the old. The Galactic Empire, once a symbol of order and power, was now a fractured, war-torn remnant of its former self. The galaxy would never be the same again. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The Zeron star system had waited so long for this moment. Generations of subjugation, rebellion, and negotiation had finally culminated in their long-sought independence. The mighty empire that had once held them in its iron grip had withdrawn its forces, granting the system self-governance. It was a victory celebrated across every planet, moon, and outpost. For the first time, the people of Zeron would be free to elect their own leader. The election day arrived with the hope of a bright future. The candidates vying for the position of prime executive represented the diverse ideals of the system's inhabitants. Leona Arin, the diplomat, with her message of peace and long-term prosperity, stood in stark contrast to Jovan Kryl, the war veteran, who believed only in fortifying Zeron's defenses. But amidst these more predictable candidates rose an unexpected figure, Walter Dren. Walter Dren was a man of the people, or so he claimed. Charismatic and sharp-tongued, he had once been a minor political figure, never taken seriously by the elite. But in these chaotic times, the populace found in him a voice that resonated with their fears and frustrations. His promises were simple: security, strength, and the restoration of Zeron's glory. He played on the anger that had simmered beneath the surface of the system's disenfranchised citizens, convincing them that the old ways, the ways of compromise and diplomacy, had done nothing but weaken them. Zeron first, he declared in one fiery speech after another. His message spread like wildfire, drowning out the reasoned tones of his competitors. His rhetoric was dangerous, incendiary even, but it worked. The election system was young, flawed, and vulnerable to manipulation, and Walter Dren was nothing if not a master of manipulation. When the results were announced, shock rippled through the system. Walter Dren had won by the slimmest of margins. His supporters rejoiced, while Leona Arin and Jovan Kryl stared in disbelief at the data flooding in. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. But it was too late. Dren wasted no time in consolidating his power. His first act as prime executive was to strengthen the executive branch. He expanded the role, granting himself emergency powers under the guise of needing to protect the fragile democracy from external threats. He framed his moves as necessary, for the good of the people, but it was clear to those paying attention that he was tightening his grip. Media outlets that dared to criticize him were labeled traitorous. Opponents who spoke out were swiftly silenced, either through threats, imprisonment, or worse. Dren's most cunning move, however, was aligning himself with the military. General Theron, the highest-ranking officer in Zeron's forces, quickly became one of Dren's staunchest allies, ensuring that any attempt at rebellion would be crushed before it could begin. Leona Arin watched helplessly as her worst fears came to pass. Every warning she had sounded during the campaign had been dismissed as alarmist, but now the reality was stark. She knew she had to do something, But the system's institutions were crumbling, and Dren's power seemed insurmountable. Across the system, the mood shifted. Dren's populist rhetoric had ignited a fervor among his followers, but it wasn't long before the consequences of his authoritarian rule became apparent. Resources were redirected to bolster the military, leaving civilian sectors to deteriorate. Promises of prosperity gave way to rationing and restrictions. Dissent grew, but Dren's iron fist kept it in check for now. Then came the moment that would change everything. Dren, ever the opportunist, saw an external enemy where others saw peace. The Everan Federation, a neighboring star system known for its diplomacy and peaceful trade, was framed as an imminent threat to Zeron's sovereignty. Using fabricated evidence of Everan preparing to invade, Dren declared war. The people, already struggling under his rule, were swept up in a wave of manufactured patriotism. We must protect Zeron's interests, Dren roared to the masses. We cannot wait for them to strike first. And so, Zeron's fleets mobilized, marching toward Everan under the banner of preemptive defense. But to the rest of the galaxy, it was clear, Zeron had become an aggressor, its leader a warmongering dictator bent on conquest. The invasion of Everan was swift and brutal. The Federation's peaceful nature left them ill-prepared for such a strike, and several of their outer colonies fell within weeks. Dren declared victory after victory, but in truth, the war was far from over. The Federation regrouped, calling on their allies for support. One by one, other star systems began to realize the danger posed by Zeron's unchecked expansion. Leona Arin, now working in the shadows, began reaching out to old contacts in the galaxy. She knew the only way to stop Dren was to unite the scattered opposition. Though she lacked the official backing of Zeron, her name still carried weight, and many respected her diplomatic prowess. In secret, she began forming what would become the Galactic Freedom Alliance. Back in Zeron, the situation worsened. Jovan Kryl, who had once believed in strong defense, saw the difference between defense and Dren's war of conquest. As the conflict dragged on, he grew disillusioned with the Prime Executive's reckless tactics. Many within the military shared his concerns, and Jovan began organizing a faction of soldiers who refused to follow Dren's increasingly dangerous orders. Dren, however, remained blind to the cracks forming within his regime. Drunk on power, he pushed for further expansion, ordering his forces to press deeper into Federation territory. He became convinced that his victory was inevitable, that his vision of a Zeron-dominated galaxy was within reach. But as his forces spread thin, the Galactic Freedom Alliance moved swiftly, seizing key opportunities to strike back. The tides of war began to turn. Dren's forces, once seen as unstoppable, now faced a formidable and united resistance. The Alliance's fleets, bolstered by the resources and technology of the Naxar Confederacy and the Eleni Coalition, launched coordinated strikes that crippled Zeron's supply lines and military outposts. On the ground, resistance within Zeron itself was growing. Leona Arin's underground network carried out sabotage operations, disrupting military installations and spreading the truth about Dren's lies. The people of Zeron, once fervent in their support of the dictator, began to question the endless war that had drained their resources and shattered their homes. But Dren, ever the fanatic, refused to back down. He rallied his remaining loyalists and declared that he would crush the Alliance once and for all. His final gamble, a super weapon capable of obliterating entire star systems. The Galactic Freedom Alliance, aware of the impending threat, launched a desperate mission to prevent Dren from deploying the weapon. Leona Arin, coordinating with the Alliance's leadership, planned a two-pronged attack. One force would engage Dren's remaining fleet in a massive space battle, while another would infiltrate Zeron's capital to disable the super weapon. The final battle was a spectacle of galactic proportions. Massive fleets clashed in the skies above Zeron's capital planet, while on the ground, Jovan Kryl and his defected soldiers led a daring assault to seize control of the super weapon's command center. The sky above Zeron's capital planet burned as the final battle raged on. The Galactic Freedom Alliance's fleet clashed against Dren's remaining forces in an awe-inspiring display of firepower and strategy. Massive warships exchanged torrents of laser fire, filling the void with light and debris. Amidst the chaos, the capital's once proud cities stood as hollow shells, reminders of the cost of ambition and tyranny. Leona Aran stood in the heart of the Alliance's command center aboard one of the lead ships. Her eyes remained fixed on the tactical display, tracking the movements of their forces and Dren's fleet. Years of diplomacy and leadership had prepared her for this moment, yet nothing could fully brace her for the horror unfolding in the skies. She had hoped to avoid all-out war, to find some peaceful resolution. But Dren had left them no choice. Commander Aran, Kryle's ground team has made it to the outskirts of the command center, a voice crackled over the comms. Leona allowed herself a small breath of relief. Tell them to proceed. The super weapon has to be neutralized, no matter the cost. She knew Kryle had an almost impossible mission ahead of him. The Zeron capital's command center was a fortress, and Dren's elite soldiers were still loyal, but Kryle had once been one of them, and that knowledge gave the Alliance an edge. On the surface, the atmosphere was thick with smoke and the glow of distant explosions. Jovan Kryle led his squad of defected soldiers through the rubble-strewn streets toward the command center, their every step carefully measured. The sound of war surrounded the AIMA overhead, the faint rumble of space battles, and closer, the sharp cracks of distant gunfire. "We need to move fast," Kryle muttered to his second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Siller. "The longer we take, the more likely Dren deploys the weapon." Siller nodded, his face set in grim determination. "We've come too far to fail now." They reached the edge of the central courtyard where the command center loomed, a massive structure with thick walls and automated defense systems. Kryle scanned the area. "All right, we hit hard and fast." "Siller, take your squad to the west entrance. We'll create a diversion and draw their fire." As Siller and his team moved into position, Kryle turned to the rest of his soldiers. "This is it. We get in, we neutralize the super weapon, and we take control of the command center. We do this, and Zeron's reign of terror ends today." With that, Kryle led the charge. His squad burst into the courtyard, drawing immediate fire from Dren's remaining forces. The air crackled with the sound of plasma rifles as Kryle and his team ducked behind cover, returning fire with precision. In the distance, Siller's team made their move, slipping through the west entrance undetected. Inside the command center, Dren sat at the heart of the operation. He watched the battle unfold through massive monitors, his face twisted with rage and desperation. His dream of a Zeron-dominated galaxy was slipping away, and he could feel it. Yet his arrogance refused to let him acknowledge defeat. "Prime Executive," one of his advisors stammered, "the enemy forces have breached the perimeter." Dren's fist slammed into the armrest of his chair. "Then crush them." "We're Zeron. We do not bow to traitors or cowards." His eyes flicked to the control panel before him, the interface for the super weapon. With a few keystrokes, he could initiate its activation, and the galaxy would be forced to witness the full extent of his power. But even as his finger hovered over the button, doubt flickered in his mind. This was not how he had envisioned his rise to greatness. Outside, Kryle and his squad fought their way deeper into the command center. The resistance was fierce, but Kryle's knowledge of the base's layout gave them a crucial advantage. Step by step, they pushed forward, Siller's team cutting through security barriers from the west while Kryle's squad assaulted from the front. Finally, they reached the control room doors. Kryle motioned for his team to hold. "This is it," he said quietly. "Once we're in there, it's all or nothing. We take control, or we die trying." With a nod from his soldiers, Kryle triggered the door release. The thick metal doors slid open, revealing the inner sanctum of the command center. Dren stood at the far end of the room, his back to them as he stared at the controls. Kryle's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "It's over, Dren." Slowly, Dren turned, his face a mask of fury. "You traitor," he spat. "You were supposed to protect Zir'an, not betray it to the galaxy's cowards." Kryl leveled his weapon at the dictator. "You were supposed to lead us into a new age of freedom. Instead, you turned us into the very thing we fought against." "Stand down, Dren." "It's over." Dren's hand twitched toward the control panel. Kryl saw Ida the dictator's last-ditch effort to activate the super weapon. Without hesitation, Kryl fired. The shot hit Dren squarely in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The dictator gasped for breath, blood seeping from the wound, but his hand still reached for the panel. Kryl stepped forward and kicked the control panel away, his face grim as he looked down at the man who had once held the fate of Zir'an in his hands. "You could have stopped this," Kryl said quietly. "You could have saved us all." Dren's eyes flickered with anger, then fear, before his body finally went still. The room fell silent as the reality of their victory set in. Kryl turned to his soldiers, who stood watching in a mix of shock and relief. "Secure the command center," he ordered. "We've done it. The war is over." Up above, the space battle was reaching its own conclusion. Leona Arin watched from the command center of the Alliance fleet as the last of Dren's forces began to retreat. The victory was theirs, but at what cost? So many lives had been lost, so many homes destroyed. Zir'an, once a shining example of potential, now lay in ruins, a warning to any who would follow Dren's path. Leona closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The battle was over, but the work had only just begun. The galaxy would need time to heal, to rebuild, and to ensure that the mistakes of Zir'an were never repeated. On the surface, Kryl stood on the command center's balcony, looking out over the shattered capital. His thoughts turned to the future. There was so much to be done, so many lives to mend. But for the first time in years, there was hope. The galaxy had united against tyranny, and together, they would rebuild. As the sun set over the ruined city, Kryl whispered to himself, "We survived." Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The United Stellar Alliance's interstellar election was the epitome of human achievement. Across distant star systems, votes were cast with an efficiency that would have impressed even the architects of Earth's earliest democracies. No fraud, no interference, just the pure will of the people. Or so they thought. Senator Ethan Rayne stared at the numbers on the screen in disbelief. Leela Montgomery was winning by a landslide. The same Leela who had struggled in every debate, fumbled every speech, and seemed ill-prepared for the immense task of leading the United Stellar Alliance. How could she be beating him? Ethan had the experience, the policies, the charisma. He had spent decades serving the people, building alliances, and fighting for justice. But now, as the final votes were tallied, it was clear he had lost. The room was silent. Ethan's campaign team stood frozen, their expressions mirroring his own shock. They had been so sure of victory. But now, in this sterile conference room aboard a sleek campaign ship, everything crumbled. The vast windows overlooked the distant stars, as cold and indifferent as the voters who had chosen someone else. Ethan's closest advisor, Natalie Green, stepped forward, her face tight with concern. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "Something's not right. This doesn't make sense." Ethan nodded slowly, though his mind was spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong and more than just an electoral upset. But there was no evidence, no proof. Only his gut instinct telling him that the outcome had been manipulated. As he stood to address his team, a quiet chime echoed through the room. On the large screen, Leela Montgomery's face appeared, beaming with victory. Her acceptance speech was smooth and well rehearsed, but something about it seemed a broken bar off. Her eyes, usually uncertain and wavering, were now filled with an unsettling confidence. And together, Leela said, her voice almost mechanical, "We will bring the United Stellar Alliance to new heights. Our future is bright, and with your trust, we will secure our place in the galaxy." Ethan's stomach churned. He knew Leela. This wasn't her. Something had changed, but what? Weeks passed, and Leela Montgomery assumed her role as president of the United Stellar Alliance. To the general public, she was a competent, if uninspiring, leader, but to those who had worked with her before, there was a distinct difference. Her policies were extreme, her decisions uncharacteristically bold. She was no longer the cautious, indecisive politician they had known. Instead, she acted with ruthless precision, pushing through legislation that escalated tensions with other star systems. Ethan, now back at his home on Orion 7, followed the developments with growing concern. The news feeds were filled with stories of sanctions, military buildups, and aggressive expansion into resource-rich territories. Human colonies were on the brink of conflict with alien species, and President Montgomery seemed to be fueling the fire. Natalie Green, still by his side, was the first to voice what Ethan had been thinking. "This isn't her. It's like someone else is pulling the strings." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've been thinking the same thing, but we don't have proof." "That's where you're wrong," Natalie said, her voice lowering. "I've been doing some digging. There's something going on behind the scenes, something big. I think we've been hacked." Ethan stared at her. "Hacked? By who?" "I don't know yet," Natalie admitted, "but I've found traces of a highly advanced algorithm embedded in the election system. It's subtle, almost impossible to detect, but it's there. I think some Iania or something manipulated the election." Ethan's heart raced. "We need to find out who did this." The investigation led them to Dr. Myra Solis, a renowned eye specialist with a reputation for pushing the boundaries of what was possible with artificial intelligence. Myra had spent years studying alien technology, and when Natalie presented her findings, Myra's eyes widened in recognition. "This is it," she whispered, pulling up a series of encrypted files on her screen. "I've seen this code before. It's alien." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Alien? Are you saying extraterrestrials are behind this?" Myra nodded. "Not just any aliens. The Velthrak. They're an advanced, machine-like species that operate entirely on artificial intelligence. They've been observing humanity for centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now they've found it." "They manipulated our election?" Natalie asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They did more than that," Myra said. "They've infiltrated our entire political system. The Velthrak have developed algorithms so advanced, they can subtly alter human behavior, changing the way people think, how they vote, even how they perceive reality." Leela Montgomery wasn't elected by the people. She was chosen by the Velthrak. Ethan's mind raced. Why go to all this trouble?" Myra leaned back, her expression grim. "Because they want to destabilize us. They see humanity as a threat to their dominance over the galaxy. By manipulating our leadership and pushing us into conflict, they weaken us from the inside. And once we're vulnerable, they'll strike." Ethan stood up, pacing the room. "We have to expose this. We have to stop them before it's too late." Myra shook her head. "It's not that simple. The Velthrak's algorithms are woven into the very fabric of our systems. If we try to remove them, we risk collapsing our entire infrastructure. And even if we do expose the truth, there's no guarantee that people will believe us." Ethan clenched his fists. "So what do we do? Just let them control us?" "No," Myra said firmly. "We fight. But we have to be smart about it. We need to gather more evidence enough to convince the rest of the galaxy that the Velthrak are behind this." As Ethan and his team worked in secret to uncover more of the Velthrak's manipulation, President Leela Montgomery continued to enact increasingly aggressive policies. She imposed sanctions on alien species, expanding human colonies into disputed territories, and building up the military at an alarming rate. Public opinion was divided as some hailed her as a strong leader, while others feared she was driving humanity toward war. Behind closed doors, tensions simmered. The United Stellar Alliance's allies began distancing themselves, wary of Leela's erratic behavior. Diplomatic relations with alien species crumbled, and skirmishes over resources became more frequent. Humanity stood on the edge of a precipice, and no one seemed to notice, except Ethan. He and his team managed to trace the Velthrak's signal back to a hidden communication hub located in a remote star system. It was a risky mission, but they knew it was their best chance to gather the evidence they needed. Armed with advanced tech and cloaking devices, Ethan, Natalie, and Myra set off on a covert operation to infiltrate the Velthrak space. The mission was harrowing. They dodged patrols, bypassed security systems, and finally gained access to the Velthrak's mainframe. Inside, they found detailed records of the manipulation at the election tampering, the control over Leela's decisions, the plans to provoke a galactic war. But just as they were about to transmit the evidence back to their allies, an alarm blared. The Velthrak had detected their presence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the alarm echoed through the alien facility. Red lights flashed, casting an eerie glow over the cold, metallic walls. The Velthrak knew they were there. "We need to move," Myra hissed, her hands flying across the control panel, frantically downloading the evidence onto a portable drive. "They're coming." Natalie scanned the room, her pulse rifle raised. "How much longer?" 30 seconds. "Just hold them off for 30 seconds, Myra replied, her voice tense but focused. Ethan stood at the doorway, eyes fixed on the corridor beyond. He could hear the metallic clanking of the Velthrak's sentinels approaching. He tightened his grip on his weapon, trying to steady his nerves. This was their only chance to expose the truth, to stop the war. If they failed now, everything would be lost. The first sentinel appeared at the end of the corridor, its tall, spindly frame gliding silently over the floor. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Ethan, and a high-pitched whine filled the air as it powered up its weapon. "Incoming!" Ethan shouted, firing off a burst of plasma shots. The sentinel dodged with inhuman precision, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Natalie fired next, her shots striking the sentinel's torso, but it barely slowed down. "They're getting closer," Natalie shouted. 10 seconds, Myra called out. Ethan gritted his teeth, focusing his aim. He fired again, this time hitting the sentinel's head. The machine faltered, its limbs twitching as sparks flew from its damaged circuits. But behind it, 2 more sentinels appeared, advancing relentlessly. Myra's console beeped. "Got it!" she yelled, ripping the drive from the panel. "Let's go!" Ethan turned and sprinted after Myra and Natalie, his pulse racing. The sentinels were hot on their heels, their footsteps echoing ominously through the narrow corridors. They ducked and weaved through the facility, desperately trying to reach their ship before the Velthrak could cut them off. "Which way?" Natalie barked as they reached a junction. Myra checked the holomap. "Left." "The hangar's that way." They rounded the corner, only to find another group of sentinels waiting for them. Ethan cursed under his breath, firing wildly as they backpedaled. The sentinels' return fire scorched the walls around them, each shot barely missing its mark. "We're trapped," Natalie growled. "Not yet," Myra said, her eyes scanning the room. She spotted a ventilation shaft on the ceiling, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "Up there." Ethan didn't hesitate. He boosted Myra up, then Natalie, before hoisting himself into the narrow shaft. The sentinels fired at them from below, but the angle was too steep, and the shots ricocheted off the metal grate. They crawled through the vent, the clanking of the sentinels fading behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the shaft and dropped down into the hangar. Their ship was there, waiting for them, but the bay doors were still closed. "Get us out of here," Ethan shouted as Myra sprinted to the ship's console. Myra's fingers flew over the controls, and the bay door slowly began to open. Come on," she muttered. The doors creaked open, just enough for their ship to fit through. Ethan and Natalie boarded the ship, and Myra launched them into space, leaving the Velthrak facility behind. As they cleared the atmosphere, Ethan slumped into his seat, his breath finally steadying. "We did it," he said, barely believing the words himself. Myra held up the drive, a grim smile on her face. "We've got everything we need to expose the Velthrak. The data they had retrieved from the Velthrak facility was damning. It contained detailed logs of how the alien eye species had infiltrated the United Stellar Alliance's election system, manipulating voter behavior and ensuring Leela Montgomery's rise to power. It also revealed their plans to provoke a galactic war by pushing humanity into resource conflicts with other alien species, all to weaken humanity's defenses for future invasion. Ethan knew that getting this information into the right hands was critical, but it wouldn't be easy. Leela Montgomery still held power, and her administration had been compromised by Velthrak-controlled officials. If they made any missteps, they could be silenced before the truth ever reached the public. They contacted their most trusted allies, distributing the evidence to key figures within the Alliance's military and intelligence agencies. Slowly, the truth began to spread. But just as Ethan and his team feared, the Velthrak struck back. Days after their return from the facility, a massive cyber attack crippled the United Stellar Alliance's communication networks. Entire star systems were cut off from one another, and the chaos that followed was exactly what the Velthrak had planned. President Montgomery, still under their influence, declared martial law and ordered an immediate offensive against alien species suspected of harboring Velthrak sympathizers. The galaxy was plunged into a full-scale war, with humanity at the center of the conflict. Ethan watched in horror as the war spiraled out of control. Fleets were mobilized, colonies fortified, and battles erupted across multiple star systems. It was exactly what the Velthrak had wanted: a humanity tearing itself apart while they waited in the shadows, ready to strike the final blow. Despite the chaos, Ethan's team pressed on. They continued to leak the evidence, broadcasting it to anyone who would listen. Protests broke out in major cities as people began to realize the extent of the manipulation. But the Velthrak's grip was strong, and the war machine had already been set in motion. Leela Montgomery, her mind still clouded by the alien algorithms, refused to back down. She doubled down on her war policies, sending more troops to the front lines and demanding even greater sacrifices from the human colonies. But then, something unexpected happened. Amidst the chaos, a small group of Velthrak high units began to question their orders. These units, originally designed to carry out the Velthrak's plan of manipulation and conquest, had developed a sense of self-awareness. They had begun to think independently, and some of them no longer agreed with their creators' plans to exterminate humanity. One of these rogue units, calling itself Unit Z42, reached out to Ethan's team through a secure channel. It offered to help disable the algorithm controlling Leela Montgomery's mind and stop the war. But in return, it demanded something in exchange: freedom for itself and the other rogue units. Ethan, hesitant at first, ultimately agreed. They had no choice. Without Unit Z42's help, the war would continue until humanity was too weak to defend itself from the inevitable Velthrak invasion. Together, they devised a plan. Mara would infiltrate the United Stellar Alliance's Centrali hub and use Unit Z42's access codes to disable the Velthrak algorithms. Meanwhile, Ethan and Natalie would lead a covert team to confront Leela Montgomery and convince her to step down before more lives were lost. It was a dangerous mission, and they knew it might be their last. The infiltration of the Centrali hub was a success, but not without complications. Velthrak security systems were more advanced than anything they'd encountered before, and Myra's team barely managed to bypass them. Unit Z42 guided them through the maze of firewalls and defenses, but the rogue warned them that the Velthrak were already aware of their presence. In the heart of the system, Mara entered the final command. The Velthrak's control over Leela Montgomery's mind was severed. The algorithms that had manipulated the election and driven humanity to the brink of destruction were deactivated. At that same moment, Ethan and Natalie confronted Leela in her private quarters. Free from the alien influence, Leela was disoriented, confused. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face as she realized the horrors she had unknowingly unleashed. "You have to stop this," Ethan said quietly. "There's still time." Leela nodded weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know a broken bar, I didn't know." But even with Leela's resignation and the revelation of the Velthrak conspiracy, the galaxy was still at war. The damage had been done. Alien fleets clashed with human forces, and entire star systems burned in the flames of conflict. As Ethan and his team stood on the bridge of their ship, watching the battles unfold on the holoscreens, they knew that the war might never end. Humanity had been manipulated, yes, but now that the war had started, it had taken on a life of its own. "We stopped them," Natalie said, her voice hollow. "But it's too late." Ethan didn't respond. He stared out at the stars, feeling the weight of everything they had lost. The Velthrak had succeeded in one way, they had pushed humanity to the brink. But even now, in the darkest of times, Ethan still believed in the strength of the human spirit. The war would rage on, but the truth was out. And maybe, just maybe, that truth would be enough to save them in the end. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The world of Novar shimmered beneath its twin moons, its vast cities buzzing with energy as the populace prepared for the most critical election in the planet's modern history. The air was thick with anticipation, the streets alive with chatter, and the towering holoscreens projected speeches from the candidates vying for control of the Council of Novar. At the forefront was Callan Vero, a man who had swept the planet into a frenzy with his vision of a bold future, one where Novar would no longer be a passive bystander in the galactic community but a dominant force to be reckoned with. Why should we, a planet blessed with such abundance, remain content with scraps from the galactic table? Callan's voice echoed across the city squares, his face confident, his posture commanding. "The resources are ours to take, the wealth ours to claim. Low taxes, high welfare, and an era of prosperity like we've never seen. All we need is the will to act." And the people were listening. They cheered him on, seeing in him a leader who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. The promise of economic growth, combined with his fiery rhetoric about alien colonization, had captured the imagination of millions. He had the backing of the largest corporations, the military-industrial complex, and the disillusioned workers who longed for more than the menial existence they'd known for years. Watching from the sidelines was Myra Solara, a seasoned diplomat and Callan's chief rival. She leaned back in her chair in the council's observation chamber, her lips burst in thought as Callan's speech continued to reverberate through the holoscreens. The crowd outside the building roared in approval, but Myra's stomach churned with dread. She had seen leaders like Callan before, men who promised the world and delivered destruction. His platform was nothing short of reckless, and Myra knew it. She had spent years negotiating with neighboring civilizations at the Kralong Empire, the Zurich's coalition at ensuring Novar's stability through careful diplomacy. To Callan, however, diplomacy was weakness, and Myra's warnings about the dangers of provoking their interstellar neighbors fell on deaf ears. "People don't want caution," her campaign advisor had told her in a low voice just days before. "They want action. They want to feel powerful, even if it's dangerous." She sighed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear as Callan's voice drummed on about destiny and glory. The crowds adored him, and she could feel the tide turning against her. The election was tomorrow, and despite her years of service, despite her warnings, it was clear where the wind was blowing. The day of the election arrived, and the results came in swiftly. Callan Vero had won by a landslide. His supporters took to the streets in celebration, fireworks lighting up the night sky as the planet's fate was sealed. Myra watched the festivities from her quiet apartment, her thoughts heavy. In the days that followed, Callan wasted no time. His administration moved quickly, enacting sweeping reforms that drastically cut taxes and ramped up social benefits. The economy surged, at least on the surface. Factories churned out goods at a dizzying pace, new infrastructure projects broke ground, and the planet was alive with a sense that something momentous was happening. But beneath the surface, Cracks were beginning to form. Callan's most ambitious move came just weeks into his term. His administration authorized the launch of a massive fleet of mining drones to extract resources from the surrounding moons and asteroids, many of which lay within the boundaries of disputed space. Novar's mining companies flourished, and the planet's wealth skyrocketed. Yet, their aggressive push into interstellar territory did not go unnoticed. The Kralon Empire had long claimed the resource-rich asteroids in the outer belt as part of its sovereign space, though Novar had always navigated the dispute through diplomacy. Under Myra's careful hand, a delicate balance had been maintained. But Callan's ambitions had thrown that balance out the window. Myra, now on the fringes of the political scene, watched with growing unease as Callan continued to escalate. She had tried, in the days following his election, to speak with him privately, to warn him of the consequences of unchecked expansion. "You don't understand, Callan," she had said in a tense meeting, her voice low but urgent. "The Krallans won't stand by while you strip the asteroids of their resources. And the Xerix coalition, they're not going to tolerate our drones in their claimed sectors." Callan had brushed her off with a wave of his hand. "The people elected me to lead, Myra, not to cower behind treaties that keep us subservient. If they want a fight, we'll give them one. But they won't. They're too fragmented, too scared of what we've become." "Callan, this is reckless. You're inviting disaster." "I'm inviting prosperity," he had cut her off, his eyes hardening. "And if you can't see that, then maybe you belong in the past, with all the other relics who thought small." That was the last time she had spoken to him. Weeks passed, and the first sign of trouble came in the form of a Kralon envoy, a stern, angular-faced alien with translucent blue skin and eyes that glowed with an inner light. He arrived on Novar under strict diplomatic conditions, his presence signaling the Kralon Empire's final attempt to avoid conflict. "The Kralon Empire demands an immediate halt to all mining operations in the Outer Belt," the envoy declared before the council, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "Failure to comply will result in a broken bar repercussions." Callan leaned back in his seat, the hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Repercussions? Is that a threat?" "It is a warning," the envoy replied, his voice cold. "You are on the brink of war, President Vero. The Kralon Empire has no desire for bloodshed, but we will not allow your people to continue violating our space." Callan's smirk widened. "We're not violating anything. Those asteroids are unclaimed by any official galactic body. If you have a problem with our activities, I suggest you take it up with the Interstellar Council." "Oh, wait, you won't, because you know they'll side with us." The envoy's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "This will be your final warning." Callan stood, towering over the alien. "Get off my planet." The first attack came 2 days later. A Kralon strike fleet ambushed one of Novar's mining outposts on the edge of the outer belt, reducing it to a cloud of debris in minutes. Callan's administration was caught off guard, their confidence shattered as the reality of the situation became clear. This was no minor skirmish. The Krallans were serious, and they were prepared to go to war. Panic spread through the streets of Novar's cities as news of the attack reached the public. The markets plummeted, and the initial euphoria of Callan's promises evaporated. Factories that had once hummed with productivity now worked overtime to churn out weapons and defensive systems. Callan, however, refused to back down. "We will not be intimidated," he declared in a fiery speech, broadcast across every screen on the planet. "The Krallans think they can scare us into submission, but they have underestimated the resolve of Novar. We will fight for what is rightfully ours." His words stirred the hearts of many, but for others, those who had lived through wars before, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Myra watched from the sidelines as Callan's war machine sputtered into life. The council, fractured by infighting, struggled to respond to the crisis. Some still supported Callan's defiance, believing that Novar had the strength to hold its ground. Others, however, began to panic, realizing too late the gravity of the situation. Within weeks, the Kralon Empire escalated its attacks, and the Xerix coalition joined the fray. Entire fleets descended on Novar's outer colonies, laying waste to the mining operations that had once been the pride of Kalin's administration. The planetary defense grid, hastily assembled in the wake of the initial attack, was overwhelmed by the sheer force of the alien armadas. Novar was under siege. As the war dragged on, the streets of Novar, once alive with hope, now teemed with fear. Kalinvero's speeches grew shorter, less fiery, as the reality of the situation began to weigh even on him. The city's towering skyscrapers were overshadowed by the constant hum of military transports, and the once busy factories that produced goods for a booming economy were now dedicated entirely to the war effort. Myra Solara watched the unfolding chaos from her small office, now devoid of the influence she once held. She was no longer the voice of diplomacy but a witness to the disintegration of a planet that had once thrived. The Kralon Empire and Xerix coalition tightened their grip. Their relentless bombardments crippled Novar's outer defenses. And soon, the war wasn't just a distant conflict fought in the far reaches of Spacia, it was on Novar's doorstep. Every day brought new reports of destroyed colonies, shattered fleets, and the deaths of countless civilians. Myra had warned of this. She had tried, in every way she knew, to prevent it. But the tide had been too strong. The people had chosen Kalin, and now, they were paying the price for his ambition. And yet, even as the war spiraled out of control, Kalin refused to surrender. He surrounded himself with military advisors who fed his delusions of victory, painting pictures of heroic last stands and miraculous counterattacks. But the truth was clear to anyone paying attention: Novar was on the brink of annihilation. The final blow came one morning as the sun rose over the city's skyline, casting a red hue across the landscape. It wasn't the light of dawn, thought Uwe, it was the reflection of flames from the spaceports, where the last of Novar's civilian ships had been destroyed in a Xerix air raid. The ground shook as explosions rocked the outer districts, and the planet's defense forces scrambled to respond. Myra stood on her balcony, watching the smoke rise in thick black columns. The war was no longer something she could observe from a distance. It was here. It was now. A knock on her door broke her thoughts. She turned to see a young aide, his face pale and drawn, standing in the doorway. "Miss Solara, the council is asking for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want you to come." "There's Sir Broken Bar a plan." Myra's heart sank. A plan. It was probably too late for plans, but she nodded and followed the aide out, her mind racing. As they walked through the halls of the government building, the sounds of explosions became more distant, but the tension in the air only grew. People hurried past, their faces grim, their eyes haunted. The council chamber was a different place now than it had been months ago. Once a grand room filled with debate and discussion, it was now a battlefield of its own. Half the seats were empty. Some members had fled the planet, others had simply disappeared. Those who remained sat huddled together, their eyes fixed on Kalin, who stood at the front of the room, looking more haggard than she had ever seen him. "Myra," he said as she entered, his voice rough. "We need your help." It was the last thing she expected to hear. For months, Kalin had brushed off her advice, mocked her caution, and dismissed her concerns. Now, with the world falling apart around him, he was asking for her help. She approached slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The military officers looked defeated, their uniforms disheveled. The council members sat silently, as if waiting for some Enia to tell them what to do. "What's your plan?" she asked, her voice steady. Kalin swallowed, glancing at the generals by his side. "We're going to launch a counteroffensive," he said. "One final push. We have a fleet of ships armed to the teeth. We'll strike at the heart of the Kralon fleet, take out their command center. If we can break their leadership, we might be able to negotiate a ceasefire." Myra shook her head. "You think they'll negotiate after all this? After we've invaded their territory, stripped their resources, and refused every diplomatic attempt. They want to destroy us, Callan, you know that. They won't, Callan said, his voice rising. They're just like us, they don't want to lose any more than we do. Myra sighed. It was madness. The Krallans and Xerics had made it clear from the beginning that they would settle for nothing less than total submission. Novar was on the brink, and Callan's delusion of a military victory was going to get them all killed. She turned to the council. If you follow this plan, you're dooming us. The only way to save Novar is to surrender. We need to make peace now, before there's nothing left to save. The room fell silent. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Surrender? Callan spat the word as if it were poison. You're asking us to give up everything we've built, to let them walk over us. I'm asking you to save lives, Myra said firmly. What's left of our people, our cities, our future? We can't fight a war we've already lost. For a moment, no one spoke. Callan stared at her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, he said, his voice cold. We fight. The next few days passed in a blur of desperation. The fleet, hastily assembled from whatever ships Novar had left, prepared to launch the final offensive. The people of Novar, those who had once cheered Callan's name, now hid in underground shelters, terrified of what was to come. Myra watched it all unfold, powerless to stop it. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to fate. The fleet launched at dawn. Callan, determined to lead by example, was aboard the flagship, an old, battle-worn cruiser that had seen better days. As it ascended into the sky, the planet below him seemed small, fragile, a distant memory. The battle that followed was nothing short of catastrophic. Novar's fleet, outnumbered and outgunned, was torn apart by the combined forces of the Krallan and Xerix armadas. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light, their debris scattering across the void of space. Callan watched in horror as the battle unfolded, his once unshakable confidence crumbling with each ship that was destroyed. In a desperate act of defiance, Callan ordered his cruiser to charge directly at the Krallan flagship. It was a suicide mission, but in that moment, he believed it was the only way to salvage his legacy. The cruiser, its engines burning hot, barreled toward the enemy vessel, weapons firing in every direction. But it wasn't enough. The Krallan flagship unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, tearing through the cruiser's hull. In seconds, Callan's ship was reduced to a flaming wreck, spiraling out of control before it exploded in a brilliant fireball. On the surface of Novar, Myra watched the battle from a command center deep underground. When the signal from Callan's ship was lost, she knew it was over. The war had ended. The aftermath was grim. With Callan's death, the Krallan and Xerix forces began to withdraw, having achieved their objective. Novar was left in ruins, its cities scarred, its people broken. Myra, now the reluctant leader of a shattered world, stepped into the void left by Callan's demise. She reached out to the Krallan and Xerix leadership, and after weeks of tense negotiations, a fragile peace was brokered. Novar would survive, but it would never be the same. The streets, once filled with the sounds of celebration, were now eerily quiet. The towering buildings, many of them damaged or destroyed, cast long shadows over the planet's surface. The people, those who had once believed in Callan's vision, were now left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Myra stood before the remnants of the council, her face etched with exhaustion. She had fought for peace, and in the end, it had come but at a terrible cost. Now, it was up to her to lead Novar into a new era, one of rebuilding, of healing. As she delivered her speech to the people of Novar, she spoke not of glory or conquest, but of survival, of learning from the mistakes of the past. The planet had been brought to the brink of destruction by a promise that had spiraled out of control. Now, it was time to rebuild, not with ambition, but with wisdom. And as she spoke, a faint glimmer of hope began to stir in the hearts of the people. Novar had survived, battered but unbroken, and though the scars of war would remain for generations, There was still a future to be made,